Rodney fails to qualify. There was a sound of revelry by night, for the first Saturday in June had arrived and the golf club was holding its monthly dance. Fairy lanterns festooned the branches of the chestnut trees on the terrace above the 9th green, and from the big dining room, cleared now of its tables and chairs, came a muffled slithering of feet and the plaintive sound of saxophones moaning softly like a man who has just missed a short putt. In a basket chair in the shadows the oldest member puffed a cigar and listened, well content. His was the peace of the man who has reached the age when he is no longer expected to dance. A door opened, and a young man came out of the clubhouse. He stood on the steps with folded arms, gazing to left and right. The oldest member, watching him from the darkness, noted that he wore an air of gloom. His brow was furrowed and he had the indefinable look of one who has been smitten in the spiritual solar plexus. Yes, where all around him was joy, jollity, and song, this young man brooded. The sound of a high tenor voice, talking rapidly and entertainingly on the subject of modern Russian thought, now intruded itself on the peace of the night. From the farther end of the terrace a girl came into the light of the lanterns, her arm in that of a second young man. She was small and pretty, he tall and intellectual. The light shone on his high forehead and glittered on his tortoiseshell-rimmed spectacles. The girl was gazing up at him with reverence and adoration, and at the sight of these twain the youth on the steps appeared to undergo some sort of spasm. His face became contorted and he wobbled. Then, with a gesture of sublime despair, he tripped over the mat and stumbled back into the clubhouse. The couple passed on and disappeared, and the oldest member had the night to himself, until the door opened once more and the club's courteous and efficient secretary trotted down the steps. The scent of the cigar drew him to where the oldest member sat, and he dropped into the chair beside him. "Seen young Ramage tonight?" asked the secretary. "He was standing on those steps only a moment ago," replied the oldest member. "Why do you ask?" "I thought perhaps you might have had a talk with him and found out what's the matter." "Can't think what's come to him tonight. Nice, civil boy as a rule, but just now, when I was trying to tell him about my short approach on the 5th this afternoon, he was positively abrupt. Gave a sort of hollow gasp and dashed away in the middle of a sentence." The oldest member sighed. "You must overlook his brusqueness," he said. "The poor lad is passing through a trying time. A short while back I was the spectator of a little drama that explains everything. Mabel Patmore is flirting disgracefully with that young fellow Purvis." "Purvis? Oh, you mean the man who won the club bowls championship last week? I can quite believe that he may have disgraced himself in the manner you describe," said the sage, coldly. "I know he plays that noxious game. And it is for that reason that I hate to see a nice girl like Mabel Patmore, who only needs a little more steadiness off the tee to become a very fair golfer, wasting her time on him. I suppose his attraction lies in the fact that he has a great flow of conversation, while poor Ramage is, one must admit, more or less of a dumb Isaac. Girls are too often snared by a glib tongue. Still, it is a pity, a great pity. The whole affair recalls irresistibly to my mind the story." The secretary rose with a whir like a rocketing pheasant. "The story," continued the sage, "of Jane Packard, William Bates, and Rodney Spelvin, which, as you have never heard it, I will now proceed to relate. Can't stop now, much as I should like. It is a theory of mine," proceeded the oldest member, attaching himself to the other's coattails and pulling him gently back into his seat, "that nothing but misery can come of the union between a golfer and an outcast whose soul has not been purified by the noblest of games. This is well exemplified by the story of Jane Packard, William Bates, and Rodney Spelvin. All sorts of things to look after. That is why I am hoping so sincerely that there is nothing more serious than a temporary flirtation in this business of Mabel Patmore and bowls playing Purvis. A girl in whose life golf has become a factor would be mad to trust her happiness to a blister whose idea of enjoyment is trundling wooden balls across a lawn. Sooner or later he is certain to fail her in some crisis. Lucky for her if this failure occurs before the marriage knot has been inextricably tied and so opens her eyes to his inadequacy, as was the case in the matter of Jane Packard, William Bates, and Rodney Spelvin. I will now, said the oldest member, tell you all about Jane Packard, William Bates, and Rodney Spelvin. The secretary uttered a choking groan. I shall miss the next dance, he pleaded. A bit of luck for some nice girl, said the sage, equably. He tightened his grip on the other's arm. Jane Packard and William Bates, said the oldest member, were not, you must understand, officially engaged. They had grown up together from childhood, and there existed between them a sort of understanding, the understanding being that, if ever William could speed himself up enough to propose, Jane would accept him, and they would settle down and live stodgily and happily ever after. For William was not one of your rapid wooers. In his affair of the heart he moved somewhat slowly and ponderously, like a motor lorry, an object which both in physique and temperament he greatly resembled. He was an extraordinarily large, powerful, ox-like young man, who required plenty of time to make up his mind about any given problem. I have seen him in the club dining room musing with a thoughtful frown for 15 minutes on end while endeavoring to weigh the rival merits of a chump chop and a sirloin steak as a luncheon dish. A placid, leisurely man. I might almost call him lymphatic. I will call him lymphatic. He was lymphatic. The first glimmering of an idea that Jane might possibly be a suitable wife for him had come to William some 3 years before this story opens. Having brooded on the matter tensely for 6 months, he then sent her a bunch of roses. In the October of the following year, nothing having occurred to alter his growing conviction that she was an attractive girl, he presented her with a 2-pound box of assorted chocolates. And from then on his progress, though not rapid, was continuous, and there seemed little reason to doubt that, should nothing come about to weaken Jane's regard for him, another 5 years or so would see the matter settled. And it did not appear likely that anything would weaken Jane's regard. They had much in common, for she was a calm, slow-moving person too. They had a mutual devotion to golf, and played together every day, and the fact that their handicaps were practically level formed a strong bond. Most divorces, as you know, spring from the fact that the husband is too markedly superior to his wife at golf. This leading him, when she starts criticizing his relations, to say bitter and unforgivable things about her mashie shots. Nothing of this kind could happen with William and Jane. They would build their life on a solid foundation of sympathy and understanding. The years would find them consoling and encouraging each other, happy married lovers. If, that is to say, William ever got round to proposing. It was not until the 4th year of this romance that I detected the first sign of any alteration in the schedule. I had happened to call on the Packards one afternoon and found them all out except Jane. She gave me tea and conversed for a while, but she seemed distrait. I had known her since she wore rompers, so felt entitled to ask if there was anything wrong. Not exactly wrong, said Jane, and she heaved a sigh. Tell me, I said. She heaved another sigh. Have you ever read The Love That Scorches, by Luella Perryton Phipps? She asked. I said I had not. I got it out of the library yesterday, said Jane, dreamily, and finished it at 3 this morning in bed. It is a very, very beautiful book. It is all about the desert and people riding on camels and a wonderful Arab chief with stern yet tender eyes and a girl called Angela and oases and dates and mirages and all like that. There is a chapter where the Arab chief seizes the girl and clasps her in his arms and she feels his hot breath searing her face and he flings her on his horse and they ride off and all around was sand and night and the mysterious stars. And somehow, oh, I don't know. She gazed yearningly at the chandelier. I wish Mother would take me to Algiers next winter, she murmured, absently. It would do her rheumatism so much good. I went away frankly uneasy. These novelists, I felt, ought to be more careful. They put ideas into girls' heads and made them dissatisfied. I determined to look William up and give him a kindly word of advice. It was no business of mine, you may say, but they were so ideally suited to one another that it seemed a tragedy that anything should come between them. And Jane was in a strange mood. At any moment, I felt, she might take a good, square look at William and wonder what she could ever have seen in him. I hurried to the boy's cottage. "William," I said, "as one who dandled you on his knee when you were a baby, I wish to ask you a personal question. Answer me this, and make it snappy. Do you love Jane Packard?" A look of surprise came into his face, followed by one of intense thought. He was silent for a space. "Who, me?" he said at length. "Yes, you." "Jane Packard?" "Yes, Jane Packard." "Do I love Jane Packard?" said William, assembling the material and arranging it neatly in his mind. He pondered for perhaps 5 minutes. "Why, of course I do," he said. "Splendid. Devotedly, dash it. Capital. You might say madly." I tapped him on his barrel-like chest. "Then my advice to you, William Bates, is to tell her so." "Now that's rather a brainy scheme," said William, looking at me admiringly. "I see exactly what you're driving at. You mean it would kind of settle things, and all that?" "Precisely. Well, I've got to go away for a couple of days tomorrow. It's the invitation tournament at Squashy Hollow, but I'll be back on Wednesday. Suppose I take her out on the links on Wednesday and propose?" "A very good idea. At the 6th hole, say?" "At the 6th hole would do excellently." "Or the 7th?" "The 6th would be better. The ground slopes from the tee, and you would be hidden from view by the dogleg turn." "Something in that. My own suggestion would be that you somehow contrive to lead her into that large bunker to the left of the 7th fairway." "Why?" "I have reason to believe that Jane would respond more readily to your wooing were it conducted in some vast sandy waste. And there is another thing," I proceeded, earnestly, "which I must impress upon you. See that there is nothing tame or tepid about your behavior when you propose. You must show zip and romance. In fact, I strongly recommend you, before you even say a word to her, to seize her and clasp her in your arms and let your hot breath sear her face." "Who, me?" said William. "Believe me, it is what will appeal to her most." "But, I say. Hot breath, I mean. Dash it all, you know, what? I assure you it is indispensable." "Seize her," said William, blankly. "Precisely. Clasp her in my arms?" "Just so." William plunged into silent thought once more. "Well, you know, I suppose," he said at length. "You've had experience, I take it. Still, oh, all right, I'll have a stab at it." There spoke the true William Bates. I said, "Go to it, lad, and heaven speed your wooing." In all human schemes, and it is this that so often brings failure to the subtlest strategists, there is always the chance of the unknown factor popping up. That unforeseen X for which we have made no allowance and which throws our whole plan of campaign out of gear. I had not anticipated anything of the kind coming along to mar the arrangements on the present occasion. But when I reached the first tee on the Wednesday afternoon to give William Bates that last word of encouragement which means so much, I saw that I had been too sanguine. William had not yet arrived, but Jane was there, and with her a tall, slim, dark-haired, sickeningly romantic-looking youth in faultlessly fitting serge. A stranger to me. He was talking to her in a musical undertone, and she seemed to be hanging on his words. Her beautiful eyes were fixed on his face, and her lips slightly parted. So absorbed was she that it was not until I spoke that she became aware of my presence. "William not arrived yet?" She turned with a start. "William? Hasn't he? Oh. No, not yet. I don't suppose he will be long. I want to introduce you to Mr. Spelvin. He has come to stay with the Wyndhams for a few weeks. He is going to walk round with us." Naturally this information came as a shock to me, but I masked my feelings and greeted the young man with a well-assumed cordiality. "Mr. George Spelvin, the actor?" I asked, shaking hands. "My cousin," he said. "My name is Rodney Spelvin. I do not share George's histrionic ambitions. If I have any claim to, may I say renown, it is as a maker of harmonies. A composer, eh?" "Verbal harmonies," explained Mr. Spelvin. "I am, in my humble fashion, a poet." "He writes the most beautiful poetry," said Jane, warmly. "He has just been reciting some of it to me." "Oh, that little thing," said Mr. Spelvin, deprecatingly. "A mere morceau. One of my juvenilia." "It was too beautiful for words," persisted Jane. "Ah, you," said Mr. Spelvin, "have the soul to appreciate it. I could wish that there were more like you, Miss Packard. We singers have much to put up with in a crass and materialistic world. Only last week a man, a course editor, asked me what my sonnet, Wine of Desire, meant. He laughed indulgently. I gave him answer, 'twas a sonnet, not a mining prospectus." "It would have served him right," said Jane, heatedly, "if you had pasted him one on the snoot." At this point a low whistle behind me attracted my attention, and I turned to perceive William Bates towering against the skyline. "Hoy," said William. I walked to where he stood, leaving Jane and Mr. Spelvin in earnest conversation with their heads close together. "I say," said William, in a rumbling undertone, "who's the bird with Jane?" "A man named Spelvin. He is visiting the Wyndhams. I suppose Mrs. Wyndham made them acquainted." "Looks a bit of a God help us," said William, critically. "He is going to walk round with you." It was impossible for a man of William Bates's temperament to start, but his face took on a look of faint concern. "Walk round with us?" So Jane said. "But look here," said William. "I can't possibly seize her and clasp her in my arms and do all that hot breath stuff with this pie-faced exhibit hanging round on the outskirts." "No, I fear not." "Postpone it, then, what?" said William, with unmistakable relief. "Well, as a matter of fact, it's probably a good thing. There was a most extraordinarily fine steak and kidney pudding at lunch, and, between ourselves, I'm not feeling what you might call keyed up to anything in the nature of a romantic scene. Some other time, eh?" I looked at Jane and the Spelvin youth, and a nameless apprehension swept over me. There was something in their attitude which I found alarming. I was just about to whisper a warning to William not to treat this new arrival too lightly, when Jane caught sight of him and called him over, and a moment later they set out on their round. I walked away pensively. This Spelvin's advent, coming immediately on top of that book of desert love, was undeniably sinister. My heart sank for William, and I waited at the clubhouse to have a word with him after his match. He came in 2 hours later, flushed and jubilant. "Played the game of my life," he said. "We didn't hole out all the putts, but, making allowance for everything, you can chalk me up an 83. Not so bad, eh? You know the 8th hole? Well, I was a bit short with my drive, and found my ball lying badly for the brassy. So I took my driving iron and with a nice easy swing let the pill have it so squarely on the seat of the pants that it flew." "Where is Jane?" I interrupted. "Jane? Oh, the bloke Spelvin has taken her home. Beware of him, William," I whispered, tensely. "Have a care, young Bates. If you don't look out, you'll have him stealing Jane from you. Don't laugh. Remember that I saw them together before you arrived." She was gazing into his eyes as a desert maiden might gaze into the eyes of a sheik. "You don't seem to realize, wretched William Bates, that Jane is an extremely romantic girl. A fascinating stranger like this, coming suddenly into her life, may well snatch her away from you before you know where you are." "That's all right," said William, lightly. "I don't mind admitting that the same idea occurred to me. But I made judicious inquiries on the way round, and found out that the fellow's a poet." You don't seriously expect me to believe that there's any chance of Jane falling in love with a poet? He spoke incredulously, for there were 3 things in the world that he held in the smallest esteem: slugs, poets, and caddies with hiccups. I think it extremely possible, if not probable, I replied. Nonsense, said William. And, besides, the man doesn't play golf. Never had a club in his hand, and says he never wants to. That's the sort of fellow he is. At this, I confess, I did experience a distinct feeling of relief. I could imagine Jane Packard, stimulated by exotic literature, committing many follies. But I was compelled to own that I could not conceive of her giving her heart to one who not only did not play golf but had no desire to play it. Such a man, to a girl of her fine nature and correct upbringing, would be beyond the pale. I walked home with William in a calm and happy frame of mind. I was to learn but 1 short week later that woman is the unfathomable, incalculable mystery, the problem we men can never hope to solve. The week that followed was one of much festivity in our village. There were dances, picnics, bathing parties, and all the other adjuncts of high summer. In these William Bates played but a minor part. Dancing was not one of his gifts. He swung, if called upon, an amiable shoe, but the disposition in the neighborhood was to refrain from calling upon him. For he had an incurable habit of coming down with his full weight upon his partner's toes, and many a fair girl had had to lie up for a couple of days after collaborating with him in a foxtrot. Picnics, again, bored him, and he always preferred a round on the links to the merriest bathing party. The consequence was that he kept practically aloof from the revels, and all through the week Jane Packard was squired by Rodney Spelvin. With Spelvin she swayed over the waxed floor. With Spelvin she dived and swam, and it was Spelvin who with zealous hand brushed ants off her mayonnaise and squashed wasps with a chivalrous teaspoon. The end was inevitable. Apart from anything else, the moon was at its full and many of these picnics were held at night. And you know what that means. It was about 10 days later that William Bates came to me in my little garden with an expression on his face like a man who didn't know it was loaded. I say, said William, you busy? I emptied the remainder of the water can on the lobelias, and was at his disposal. I say, said William, rather a rotten thing has happened. You know Jane? I said I knew Jane. You know Spelvin? I said I knew Spelvin. Well, Jane's gone and got engaged to him, said William, aggrieved. What? It's a fact. Already? Absolutely. She told me this morning. And what I want to know, said the stricken boy, sitting down thoroughly unnerved on a basket of strawberries, is, where do I get off? My heart bled for him, but I could not help reminding him that I had anticipated this. You should not have left them so much alone together, I said. You must have known that there is nothing more conducive to love than the moon in June. Why, songs have been written about it. In fact, I cannot at the moment recall a song that has not been written about it. Yes, but how was I to guess that anything like this would happen? Cried William, rising and scraping strawberries off his person. Who would ever have supposed Jane Packard would leap off the dock with a fellow who doesn't play golf? Certainly, as you say, it seems almost incredible. You are sure you heard her correctly? When she told you about the engagement, I mean. There was no chance that you could have misunderstood? Not a bit of it. As a matter of fact, what led up to the thing, if you know what I mean, was me proposing to her myself. I'd been thinking a lot during the last 10 days over what you said to me about that, and the more I thought of it the more of a sound egg the notion seemed. So I got her alone up at the clubhouse and said, I say, old girl, what about it? And she said, what about what? And I said, what about marrying me? Don't if you don't want to, of course, I said, but I'm bound to say it looks pretty good to me. And then she said she loved another, this bloke Spelvin, to wit. A nasty jar, I can tell you, it was. I was just starting off on a round, and it made me hook my putts on every green. But did she say specifically that she was engaged to Spelvin? She said she loved him. There may be hope. If she is not irrevocably engaged, the fancy may pass. I think I will go and see Jane and make tactful inquiries. I wish you would, said William. And, I say, you haven't any stuff that'll take strawberry juice off a fellow's trousers, have you? My interview with Jane that evening served only to confirm the bad news. Yes, she was definitely engaged to the man Spelvin. In a burst of girlish confidence she told me some of the details of the affair. The moon was shining and a soft breeze played in the trees, she said. And suddenly he took me in his arms, gazed deep into my eyes, and cried, I love you. I worship you. I adore you. You are the tree on which the fruit of my life hangs, my mate, my woman, predestined to me since the first star shone up in yonder sky. Nothing, I agreed, could be fairer than that. And then? I said, thinking how different it all must have been from William Bates's miserable, limping proposal. Then we fixed it up that we would get married in September. You are sure you are doing wisely? I ventured. Her eyes opened. Why do you say that? Well, you know, whatever his other merits, and no doubt they are numerous, Rodney Spelvin does not play golf. No, but he's very broad-minded about it. I shuddered. Women say these things so lightly. Broad-minded? Yes. He has no objection to my going on playing. He says he likes my pretty enthusiasms. There seemed nothing more to say on that subject. Well, I said, I am sure I wish you every happiness. I had hoped, of course, but never mind that. What? I had hoped, as you insist on my saying it, that you and William Bates. A shadow passed over her face. Her eyes grew sad. Poor William. I'm awfully sorry about that. He's a dear. A splendid fellow, I agreed. He has been so wonderful about the whole thing. So many men would have gone off and shot grizzly bears or something. But William just said, right-o. In a quiet voice, and he's going to caddy for me at Mossy Heath next week. There is good stuff in the boy. Yes. She sighed. If it wasn't for Rodney, oh, well. I thought it would be tactful to change the subject. So you have decided to go to Mossy Heath again? Yes. And I'm really going to qualify this year. The annual invitation tournament at Mossy Heath was one of the most important fixtures of our local female golfing year. As is usual with these affairs, it began with a medal play qualifying round. The 32 players with the lowest net scores then proceeding to fight it out during the remainder of the week by match play. It gratified me to hear Jane speak so confidently of her chances, for this was the 4th year she had entered, and each time, though she had started out with the brightest prospects, she had failed to survive the qualifying round. Like so many golfers, she was 50% better at match play than at medal play. Mossy Heath, being a championship course, is full of nasty pitfalls. And on each of the 3 occasions on which she had tackled it, one very bad hole had undone all her steady work on the other 17 and ruined her card. I was delighted to find her so undismayed by failure. I am sure you will, I said. Just play your usual careful game. It doesn't matter what sort of a game I play this time, said Jane, jubilantly. I've just heard that there are only 32 entries this year, so that everybody who finishes is bound to qualify. I have simply got to get round somehow, and there I am. It would seem somewhat superfluous in these circumstances to play a qualifying round at all. Oh, but they must. You see, there are prizes for the best 3 scores, so they have to play it. But isn't it a relief to know that, even if I come to grief on that beastly 7th, as I did last year, I shall still be all right? It is, indeed. I have a feeling that once it becomes a matter of match play you will be irresistible. I do hope so. It would be lovely to win with Rodney looking on. Will he be looking on? Yes. He's going to walk round with me. Isn't it sweet of him? Her fiancé's name having slid into the conversation again, she seemed inclined to become eloquent about him. I left her, however, before she could begin. To one so strongly pro-William as myself, eulogistic prattle about Rodney Spelvin was repugnant. I disapproved entirely of this infatuation of hers. I am not a narrow-minded man, I quite appreciate the fact that non-golfers are entitled to marry. But I could not countenance their marrying potential winners of the Ladies' Invitation Tournament at Mossy Heath. The Greens Committee, as Greens Committees are so apt to do in order to justify their existence, have altered the Mossy Heath course considerably since the time of which I am speaking. But they have left the 3 most poisonous holes untouched. I refer to the 4th, the 7th, and the 15th. Even a soulless Greens Committee seems to have realized that golfers, long-suffering though they are, can be pushed too far. And that the addition of even a single extra bunker to any of these dreadful places would probably lead to armed riots in the clubhouse. Jane Packard had done well on the first 3 holes, but as she stood on the 4th tee she was conscious, despite the fact that this seemed to be one of her good days, of a certain nervousness. And oddly enough, great as was her love for Rodney Spelvin, it was not his presence that gave her courage, but the sight of William Bates's large, friendly face and the sound of his pleasant voice urging her to keep her being down and refrain from pressing. As a matter of fact, to be perfectly truthful, there was beginning already to germinate within her by this time a faint but definite regret that Rodney Spelvin had decided to accompany her on this qualifying round. It was sweet of him to bother to come, no doubt, but still there was something about Rodney that did not seem to blend with the holy atmosphere of a championship course. He was the one romance of her life and their souls were bound together for all eternity, but the fact remained that he did not appear to be able to keep still while she was making her shots. And his light humming, musical though it was, militated against accuracy on the green. He was humming now as she addressed her ball, and for an instant a spasm of irritation shot through her. She fought it down bravely and concentrated on her drive, and when the ball soared over the cross bunker she forgot her annoyance. There is nothing so mellowing, so conducive to sweet and genial thoughts, as a real juicy one straight down the middle, and this was a Piptorino. "Nice work," said William Bates, approvingly. Jane gave him a grateful smile and turned to Rodney. It was his appreciation that she wanted. He was not a golfer, but even he must be able to see that her drive had been something out of the common. Rodney Spelvin was standing with his back turned, gazing out over the rolling prospect, one hand shading his eyes. "That vista there," said Rodney. "That calm, wooded hollow bathed in the golden sunshine. It reminds me of the island valley of Avilion. Did you see my drive, Rodney? Where falls not rain nor hail nor any snow, nor ever wind blows loudly." Your drive? No, I didn't. Again Jane Packard was aware of that faint, wistful regret. But this was swept away a few moments later in the ecstasy of a perfect iron shot which plunked her ball nicely onto the green. The last time she had played this hole she had taken 7, for all round the plateau green are sinister sand bunkers, each beckoning the ball into its hideous depths. And now she was on in 2 and life was very sweet. Putting was her strong point, so that there was no reason why she should not get a snappy 4 on one of the nastiest holes on the course. She glowed with a strange emotion as she took her putter, and as she bent over her ball the air seemed filled with soft music. It was only when she started to concentrate on the line of her putt that this soft music began to bother her. Then, listening, she became aware that it proceeded from Rodney Spelvin. He was standing immediately behind her, humming an old French love song. It was the sort of old French love song to which she could have listened for hours in some scented garden under the young May moon. But on the green of the 4th at Mossy Heath it got right in amongst her nerve centers. "Rodney, please." Jane found herself wishing that Rodney Spelvin would not say, whenever she spoke to him. "Do you mind not humming?" said Jane. "I want to putt." Put on, child, put on, said Rodney Spelvin, indulgently. I don't know what you mean, but, if it makes you happy to put to your heart's content. Jane bent over her ball again. She had got the line now. She brought back her putter with infinite care. My God, exclaimed Rodney Spelvin, going off like a bomb. Jane's ball, sharply jabbed, shot past the hole and rolled on about 3 yards. She spun round in anguish. Rodney Spelvin was pointing at the horizon. What a bit of color, he cried. Did you ever see such a bit of color? Oh, Rodney, moaned Jane. Jane gulped and walked to her ball. Her 4th putt trickled into the hole. Did you win? Said Rodney Spelvin, amiably. Jane walked to the 5th tee in silence. The 5th and 6th holes at Mossy Heath are long, but they offer little trouble to those who are able to keep straight. It is as if the architect of the course had relaxed over these two in order to ensure that his malignant mind should be at its freshest and keenest when he came to design the pestilential 7th. This 7th, as you may remember, is the hole at which Sandy McHoots, then Open champion, took an 11 on an important occasion. It is a short hole, and a full mashie will take you nicely on to the green. Provided you can carry the river that frolics just beyond the tee and seems to plead with you to throw it a ball to play with. Once on the green, however, the problem is to stay there. The green itself is about the size of a drawing-room carpet, and in the summer, when the ground is hard, a ball that has not the maximum of backspin is apt to touch lightly and bound off into the river beyond. For this is an island green, where the stream bends like a serpent. I refresh your memory with these facts in order that you may appreciate to the full what Jane Packard was up against. The woman with whom Jane was partnered had the honor, and drove a nice high ball which fell into one of the bunkers to the left. She was a silent, patient-looking woman, and she seemed to regard this as perfectly satisfactory. She withdrew from the tee and made way for Jane. Nice work, said William Bates, a moment later. For Jane's ball, soaring in a perfect arc, was dropping, it seemed, on the very pin. Oh, Rodney, look, cried Jane. Said Rodney Spelvin. His remark was drowned in a passionate squeal of agony from his betrothed. The most poignant of all tragedies had occurred. The ball, touching the green, leaped like a young lamb, scuttled past the pin, and took a running dive over the cliff. There was a silence. Jane's partner, who was seated on the bench by the sandbox reading a pocket edition in limp leather of Vardon's What Every Young Golfer Should Know, with which she had been refreshing herself at odd moments all through the round, had not observed the incident. William Bates, with the tact of a true golfer, refrained from comment. Jane was herself swallowing painfully. It was left to Rodney Spelvin to break the silence. Good, he said. Jane Packard turned like a stepped-on worm. What do you mean, good? You hit your ball farther than she did. I sent it into the river, said Jane, in a low, toneless voice. Capital, said Rodney Spelvin, delicately masking a yawn with 2 fingers of his shapely right hand. Capital. Capital. Her face contorted with pain, Jane put down another ball. Playing 3, she said. The student of Vardon marked the place in her book with her thumb, looked up, nodded, and resumed her reading. Nice W, began William Bates, as the ball soared off the tee, and checked himself abruptly. Already he could see that the unfortunate girl had put too little beef into it. The ball was falling. It fell. A crystal fountain flashed up towards the sun. The ball lay floating on the bosom of the stream, only some few feet short of the island. But, as has been well pointed out, that little less and how far away. Playing 5, said Jane, between her teeth. What, inquired Rodney Spelvin, chattily, lighting a cigarette, is the record break? Playing 5, said Jane, with a dreadful calm, and gripped her mashie. Half a second, said William Bates, suddenly. I say, I believe you could play that last one from where it floats. A good crisp slosh with a niblick would put you on, and you'd be there in 4, with a chance for a 5. Worth trying, what? I mean, no sense in dropping strokes unless you have to. Jane's eyes were gleaming. She threw William a look of infinite gratitude. Why, I believe I could. Worth having a dash. There's a boat down there. I could row, said William. I could stand in the middle and slosh, cried Jane. And what's his name, that, said William, jerking his head in the direction of Rodney Spelvin, who was strolling up and down behind the tee, humming a gay Venetian barcarolle, could steer. William, said Jane, fervently, you're a darling. Oh, I don't know, said William, modestly. There's no one like you in the world. Rodney. Said Rodney Spelvin. We're going out in that boat. I want you to steer. Rodney Spelvin's face showed appreciation of the change of program. Golf bored him, but what could be nicer than a gentle row in a boat? Capital, he said. Capital. Capital. There was a dreamy look in Rodney Spelvin's eyes as he leaned back with the tiller ropes in his hands. This was just his idea of the proper way of passing a summer afternoon. Drifting lazily over the silver surface of the stream. His eyes closed. He began to murmur softly. All today the slow sleek ripples hardly bear up shoreward, charged with sighs more light than laughter, faint and fair, like a woodland lake's weak wavelets lightly lingering forward. Soft and listless as the, here. Hi. For at this moment the silver surface of the stream was violently split by a vigorously wielded niblick, the boat lurched drunkenly. And over his Panama-hatted head and down his grey-flannelled torso there descended a cascade of water. Here. Hi, cried Rodney Spelvin. He cleared his eyes and gazed reproachfully. Jane and William Bates were peering into the depths. I missed it, said Jane. There she spouts, said William, pointing. Ready? Jane raised her niblick. Here. Hi, bleated Rodney Spelvin, as a second cascade poured damply over him. He shook the drops off his face, and perceived that Jane was regarding him with hostility. I do wish you wouldn't talk just as I am swinging, she said, pettishly. Now you've made me miss it again. If you can't keep quiet, I wish you wouldn't insist on coming round with one. Can you see it, William? There she blows, said William Bates. Here. You aren't going to do it again, are you? Cried Rodney Spelvin. Jane bared her teeth. I'm going to get that ball onto the green if I have to stay here all night, she said. Rodney Spelvin looked at her and shuddered. Was this the quiet, dreamy girl he had loved? This Maenad? Her hair was lying in damp wisps about her face, her eyes were shining with an unearthly light. No, but really, he faltered. Jane stamped her foot. What are you making all this fuss about, Rodney? She snapped. Where is it, William? There she dips, said William, playing 6. Playing 6. Let her go, said William. Let her go it is, said Jane. A perfect understanding seemed to prevail between these two. Splash. The woman on the bank looked up from her Vardon as Rodney Spelvin's agonized scream rent the air. She saw a boat upon the water, a man rowing the boat, another man, hatless, gesticulating in the stern, a girl beating the water with a niblick. She nodded placidly and understandingly. A niblick was the club she would have used herself in such circumstances. Everything appeared to her entirely regular and orthodox. She resumed her book. Splash. Playing 15, said Jane. 15 is right, said William Bates. Splash. 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 Playing 44. 44 is correct. Splash. 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 83? Said Jane, brushing the hair out of her eyes. No. "Only 82, said William Bates. "Where is it?" "There she drifts." A dripping figure rose violently in the stern of the boat, spouting water like a public fountain. For what seemed to him like an eternity Rodney Spelvin had ducked and spluttered and writhed, and now it came to him abruptly that he was through. He bounded from his seat, and at the same time Jane swung with all the force of her supple body. There was a splash beside which all the other splashes had been as nothing. The boat overturned and went drifting away. 3 bodies plunged into the stream. 3 heads emerged from the water. The woman on the bank looked absently in their direction. Then she resumed her book. "It's all right," said William Bates, contentedly. "We're in our depth." "My bag," cried Jane. "My bag of clubs." "Must have sunk," said William. "Rodney," said Jane, "my bag of clubs is at the bottom somewhere. Dive under and swim about and try to find it." "It's bound to be around somewhere," said William Bates, encouragingly. Rodney Spelvin drew himself up to his full height. It was not an easy thing to do, for it was muddy where he stood, but he did it. "Damn your bag of clubs," he bellowed, lost to all shame. "I'm going home." With painful steps, tripping from time to time and vanishing beneath the surface, he sloshed to the shore. For a moment he paused on the bank, silhouetted against the summer sky, then he was gone. Jane Packard and William Bates watched him go with amazed eyes. "I never would have dreamed," said Jane, dazedly, "that he was that sort of man." "A bad lot," said William Bates. "The sort of man to be upset by the merest trifle." "Must have a naturally bad disposition," said William Bates. "Why, if a little thing like this could make him so rude and brutal and horrid, it wouldn't be safe to marry him." "Taking a big chance," agreed William Bates. "Sort of fellow who would poison the cat's milk and kick the baby in the face." He took a deep breath and disappeared. "Here are your clubs, old girl," he said, coming to the surface again. "Only wanted a bit of looking for." "Oh, William," said Jane, "you are the most wonderful man on earth." "Would you go so far as that?" said William. "I was mad, ever to get engaged to that brute." "Now there," said William Bates, removing an eel from his left breast pocket, "I'm absolutely with you. Thought so all along, but didn't like to say so. What I mean is, a girl like you, keen on golf and all that sort of thing, ought to marry a chap like me, keen on golf and everything of that description." "William," cried Jane, passionately, detaching a newt from her right ear, "I will." "Silly nonsense, when you come right down to it, you're marrying a fellow who doesn't play golf. Nothing in it. I'll break off the engagement the moment I get home." "You couldn't make a sounder move, old girl." "William." "Jane." The woman on the bank, glancing up as she turned a page, saw a man and a girl embracing, up to their waists in water. It seemed to have nothing to do with her. She resumed her book. Jane looked lovingly into William's eyes. "William," she said, "I think I have loved you all my life." "Jane," said William, "I'm dashed sure I've loved you all my life. Meant to tell you so a dozen times, but something always seemed to come up." "William," said Jane, "you're an angel and a darling. Where's the ball?" "There she pops." "Playing 84? 84 it is," said William. "Slow back, keep your eye on the ball, and don't press." The woman on the bank began chapter 25. Jane gets off the fairway. The side door leading into the smoking room opened, and the golf club's popular and energetic secretary came trotting down the steps on to the terrace above the 9th green. As he reached the gravel, a wandering puff of wind blew the door to with a sharp report, and the oldest member, who had been dozing in a chair over his Wodehouse on the niblick, unclosed his eyes. Blinking in the strong light, he perceived the secretary skimming to and fro like a questing dog. "You have lost something?" he inquired, courteously. "Yes, a book." "I wish," said the secretary, annoyed, "that people would leave things alone. You haven't seen a novel called The Man with the Missing Eyeball anywhere about, have you? I'll swear I left it on one of these seats when I went in to lunch. You are better without it, said the sage, with a touch of austerity. I do not approve of these trashy works of fiction. How much more profitably would your time be spent in mastering the contents of such a volume as I hold in my hand? This is the real literature. The secretary drew nearer, peering discontentedly about him, and as he approached the oldest member sniffed inquiringly. What, he said, is that odor of? Ah, I see that you are wearing them in your buttonhole. White violets, he murmured. White violets. Dear me. The secretary smirked. A girl gave them to me, he said, coyly. Nice, aren't they? He squinted down complacently at the flowers, thus missing a sudden sinister gleam in the oldest member's eye, a gleam which, had he been on his guard, would have sent him scudding over the horizon. For it was the gleam which told that the sage had been reminded of a story. White violets, said the oldest member, in a meditative voice. A curious coincidence that you should be wearing white violets and looking for a work of fiction. The combination brings irresistibly to my mind. Realizing his peril too late, the secretary started violently. A gentle hand urged him into the adjoining chair. The story, proceeded the oldest member, of William Bates, Jane Packard, and Rodney Spelvin. The secretary drew a deep breath of relief, and the careworn look left his face. It's all right, he said, briskly. You told me that one only the other day. I remember every word of it. Jane Packard got engaged to Rodney Spelvin, the poet, but her better feelings prevailed in time, and she broke it off and married Bates, who was a golfer. I recall the whole thing distinctly. This man Bates was an unromantic sort of chap, but he loved Jane Packard devotedly. Bless my soul, how it all comes back to me. No need to tell it me at all. What I am about to relate now, said the sage, tightening his grip on the other's coat sleeve, is another story about William Bates, Jane Packard, and Rodney Spelvin. Inasmuch, said the oldest member, as you have not forgotten the events leading up to the marriage of William Bates and Jane Packard, I will not repeat them. All I need say is that that curious spasm of romantic sentiment which had caused Jane to fall temporarily under the spell of a man who was not only a poet but actually a non-golfer appeared to have passed completely away, leaving no trace behind. From the day she broke off her engagement to Spelvin and plighted her troth to young Bates, nothing could have been more eminently sane and satisfactory than her behavior. She seemed entirely her old self once more. 2 hours after William had led her down the aisle, she and he were out on the links, playing off the final of the mixed foursomes. Which, and we all thought it the best of omens for their married happiness, they won hands down. A deputation of all that was best and fairest in the village then escorted them to the station to see them off on their honeymoon, which was to be spent in a series of visits to well-known courses throughout the country. Before the train left, I took young William aside for a moment. I had known both him and Jane since childhood, and the success of their union was very near my heart. William, I said, a word with you. Make it snappy, said William. You have learned by this time, I said, that there is a strong romantic streak in Jane. It may not appear on the surface, but it is there. And this romantic streak will cause her, like so many wives, to attach an exaggerated importance to what may seem to you trivial things. She will expect from her husband not only love and a constant tender solicitude. Speed it up, urged William. What I am trying to say is that, after the habit of wives, she will expect you to remember each year the anniversary of your wedding day, and will be madder than a wet hen if you forget it. That's all right. I thought of that myself. It is not all right, I insisted. Unless you take the most earnest precautions, you are absolutely certain to forget. A year from now you will come down to breakfast, and Jane will say to you, "Do you know what day it is today?" And you will answer, "Tuesday," and reach for the ham and eggs, thus inflicting on her gentle heart a wound from which it will not readily recover. Nothing like it, said William, with extraordinary confidence. I've got a system calculated to beat the game every time. You know how fond Jane is of white violets? Is she? She loves them. The bloke Spelvin used to give her a bunch every day. That's how I got the idea. Nothing like learning the shots from your opponent. I've arranged with a florist that a bunch of white violets is to be shipped to Jane every year on this day. I paid 5 years in advance. I am, therefore, speaking in the most conservative spirit, on velvet. Even if I forget the day, the violets will be there to remind me. I've looked at it from every angle, and I don't see how it can fail. Tell me frankly, is the scheme a wham or is it not? A most excellent plan, I said, relieved. And the next moment the train came in. I left the station with my mind at rest. It seemed to me that the only possible obstacle to the complete felicity of the young couple had been removed. Jane and William returned in due season from their honeymoon, and settled down to the normal life of a healthy young couple. Each day they did their round in the morning and their 2 rounds in the afternoon, and after dinner they would sit hand in hand in the peaceful dusk, reminding one another of the best shots they had brought off at the various holes. Jane would describe to William how she got out of the bunker on the 5th, and William would describe to Jane the low raking windcheater he did on the 7th. And then for a moment they would fall into that blissful silence which only true lovers know, until William, illustrating his remarks with a walking stick, would show Jane how he did that pinsplitter with the mashie on the 16th. An ideally happy union, one would have said. But all the while a little cloud was gathering. As the anniversary of their wedding day approached, a fear began to creep into Jane's heart that William was going to forget it. The perfect husband does not wait till the dawning of the actual day to introduce the anniversary motif into his conversation. As long as a week in advance he is apt to say, dreamily, about this time a year ago I was getting the old silk hat polished up for the wedding, or, just about now, a year ago. They sent home the sponge-bag trousers, as worn, and I tried them on in front of the looking-glass. But William said none of these things. Not even on the night before the all-important date did he make any allusion to it, and it was with a dull feeling of foreboding that Jane came down to breakfast next morning. She was first at the table, and was pouring out the coffee when William entered. He opened the morning paper and started to peruse its contents in silence. Not a yip did he let out of him to the effect that this was the maddest, merriest day of all the glad new year. "William," said Jane. "Hello?" "William," said Jane, and her voice trembled a little, "what day is it today?" William looked at her over the paper, surprised. "Wednesday, old girl," he replied. "Don't you remember that yesterday was Tuesday? Shocking memory you've got." He then reached out for the sausages and bacon and resumed his reading. "Jane," he said, suddenly. "Jane, old girl, there's something I want to tell you." "Yes," said Jane, her heart beginning to flutter. "Something important." "Yes?" "It's about these sausages." "They are the very best," said William, earnestly, "that I have ever bitten." "Where did you get them?" "From Brownlow." "Stick to him," said William. Jane rose from the table and wandered out into the garden. The sun shone gaily, but for her the day was bleak and cold. That William loved her she did not doubt. But that streak of romance in her demanded something more than mere placid love. And when she realized that the poor mutt with whom she had linked her lot had forgotten the anniversary of their wedding day first crack out of the box, her woman's heart was so wounded that for 2 pins she could have beamed him with a brick. It was while she was still brooding in this hostile fashion that she perceived the postman coming up the garden. She went to meet him, and was handed a couple of circulars and a mysterious parcel. She broke the string, and behold, a cardboard box containing white violets. Jane was surprised. Who could be sending her white violets? No message accompanied them. There was no clue whatever to their origin. Even the name of the florist had been omitted. Now, who, mused Jane, and suddenly started as if she had received a blow. Rodney Spelvin. Yes, it must be he. How many a bunch of white violets had he given her in the brief course of their engagement? This was his poetic way of showing her that he had not forgotten. All was over between them, she had handed him his hat and given him the air, but he still remembered. Jane was a good and dutiful wife. She loved her William, and no others need apply. Nevertheless, she was a woman. She looked about her cautiously. There was nobody in sight. She streaked up to her room and put the violets in water. And that night, before she went to bed, she gazed at them for several minutes with eyes that were a little moist. Poor Rodney. He could be nothing to her now, of course, but a dear lost friend. But he had been a good old scout in his day. It is not my purpose to weary you with repetitious detail in this narrative. I will, therefore, merely state that the next year and the next year and the year after that precisely the same thing took place in the Bateses' home. Punctually every September the 7th William placidly forgot, and punctually every September the 7th the sender of the violets remembered. It was about a month after the 5th anniversary, when William had got his handicap down to 9 and little Braid Vardon Bates, their only child, had celebrated his 4th birthday. That Rodney Spelvin, who had hitherto confined himself to poetry, broke out in a new place and inflicted upon the citizenry a novel entitled The Purple Fan. I saw the announcement of the publication in the papers, but beyond a passing resolve that nothing would induce me to read the thing I thought no more of the matter. It is always thus with life's really significant happenings. Fate sneaks its deadliest wallops in on us with such seeming nonchalance. How could I guess what that book was to do to the married happiness of Jane and William Bates? In deciding not to read The Purple Fan I was to discover, overestimated my powers of resistance. Rodney Spelvin's novel turned out to be one of those things which it is impossible not to read. Within a week of its appearance it had begun to go through the country like Spanish influenza. And, much as I desired to avoid it, a perusal was forced on me by sheer weight of mass thinking. Every paper that I picked up contained reviews of the book, references to it, letters from the clergy denouncing it. And when I read that 316 mothers had signed a petition to the authorities to have it suppressed, I was reluctantly compelled to spring the necessary cash and purchase a copy. I had not expected to enjoy it, and I did not. Written in the neo-decadent style, which is so popular nowadays, its preciosity offended me. And I particularly objected to its heroine, a young woman of a type which, if met in real life, only ingrained chivalry could have prevented a normal man from kicking extremely hard. Having skimmed through it, I gave my copy to the man who came to inspect the drains. If I had any feeling about the thing, it was a reflection that, if Rodney Spelvin had had to get a novel out of his system, this was just the sort of novel he was bound to write. I remember experiencing a thankfulness that he had gone so entirely out of Jane's life. How little I knew. Jane, like every other woman in the village, had bought her copy of The Purple Fan. She read it surreptitiously, keeping it concealed, when not in use, beneath a cushion on the Chesterfield. It was not its general tone that caused her to do this, but rather the subconscious feeling that she, a good wife, ought not to be deriving quite so much enjoyment from the work of a man who had occupied for a time such a romantic place in her life. For Jane, unlike myself, adored the book. Eulalie French, its heroine, whose appeal I had so missed, seemed to her the most fascinating creature she had ever encountered. She had read the thing through 6 times when, going up to town one day to do some shopping, she ran into Rodney Spelvin. They found themselves standing side by side on the pavement, waiting for the traffic to pass. "Rodney," gasped Jane. It was a difficult moment for Rodney Spelvin. 5 years had passed since he had last seen Jane. And in those 5 years so many delightful creatures had made a fuss of him that the memory of the girl to whom he had once been engaged for a few weeks had become a little blurred. In fact, not to put too fine a point on it, he had forgotten Jane altogether. The fact that she had addressed him by his first name seemed to argue that they must have met at some time somewhere. But, though he strained his brain, absolutely nothing stirred. The situation was one that might have embarrassed another man, but Rodney Spelvin was a quick thinker. He saw at a glance that Jane was an extremely pretty girl, and it was his guiding rule in life never to let anything like that get past him. So he clasped her hand warmly, allowed an expression of amazed delight to sweep over his face, and gazed tensely into her eyes. "You," he murmured, playing it safe. "You, little one." Jane stood 5'7" in her stockings and had a forearm like the village blacksmith's, but she liked being called little one. "How strange that we should meet like this," she said, blushing brightly. "After all these years," said Rodney Spelvin, taking a chance. It would be a nuisance if it turned out that they had met at a studio party the day before yesterday, but something seemed to tell him that she dated back a goodish way. Besides, even if they had met the day before yesterday, he could get out of it by saying that the hours had seemed like years. For you cannot stymie these modern poets. The boys are there. "More than 5, murmured Jane. "Now where the deuce was I 5 years ago?" Rodney Spelvin asked himself. Jane looked down at the pavement and shuffled her left shoe nervously. "I got the violets, Rodney," she said. Rodney Spelvin was considerably fogged, but he came back strongly. "That's good," he said. "You got the violets? That's capital. I was wondering if you would get the violets. It was like you to send them." Rodney blinked, but recovered himself immediately. He waved his hand with a careless gesture, indicative of restrained nobility. "Oh, as to that. Especially as I'm afraid I treated you rather badly. But it really was for the happiness of both of us that I broke off the engagement. You do understand that, don't you?" A light broke upon Rodney Spelvin. He had been confident that it would if he only stalled along for a while. Now he placed this girl. She was Jane something, the girl he had been engaged to. By Jove, yes. He knew where he was now. "Do not let us speak of it," he said, registering pain. It was quite easy for him to do this. All there was to it was tightening the lips and drawing up the left eyebrow. He had practiced it in front of his mirror, for a fellow never knew when it might not come in useful. "So you didn't forget me, Rodney?" "Forget you?" There was a short pause. "I read your novel," said Jane. "I loved it." She blushed again, and the color in her cheeks made her look so remarkably pretty that Rodney began to feel some of the emotions which had stirred him 5 years ago. He decided that this was a good thing and wanted pushing along. "I hoped that you might," he said in a low voice, massaging her hand. He broke off and directed into her eyes a look of such squashy sentimentality that Jane reeled where she stood. "I wrote it for you," he added, simply. Jane gasped. "For me?" "I supposed you would have guessed," said Rodney. "Surely you saw the dedication?" The purple fan had been dedicated, after Rodney Spelvin's eminently prudent fashion, to "one who will understand." He had frequently been grateful for the happy inspiration. "The dedication?" "To one who will understand," said Rodney, softly. "Who would that be but you?" "Oh, Rodney. And didn't you recognize Eulalie, Jane? Surely you cannot have failed to recognize Eulalie?" "Recognize her?" "I drew her from you," said Rodney Spelvin. Jane's mind was in a whirl as she went home in the train. To have met Rodney Spelvin again was enough in itself to stimulate into activity that hidden pulse of romance in her. To discover that she had been in his thoughts so continuously all these years and that she still held such sway over his faithful heart that he had drawn the heroine of his novel from her was simply devastating. Mechanically she got out at the right station and mechanically made her way to the cottage. She was relieved to find that William was still out on the links. She loved William devotedly, of course, but just at the moment he would have been in the way, for she wanted a quiet hour with the purple fan. It was necessary for her to reread in the light of this new knowledge the more important of the scenes in which Eulalie French figured. She knew them practically by heart already, but nevertheless she wished to read them again. When William returned, warm and jubilant, she was so absorbed that she only just had time to slide the book under the sofa cushion before the door opened. Some guardian angel ought to have warned William Bates that he was selecting a bad moment for his re-entry into the home. Or at least to have hinted that a preliminary wash and brush-up would be no bad thing. There had been rain in the night, causing the links to become a trifle soggy in spots, and William was one of those energetic golfers who do not spare themselves. The result was that his pleasant features were a good deal obscured by mud. An explosion shot out of the bunker on the 14th had filled his hair with damp sand, and his shoes were a disgrace to any refined home. No, take him for all in all, William did not look his best. He was fine if the sort of man you admired was the brawny athlete straight from the dust of the arena. But on a woman who was picturing herself the heroine of the Purple Fan he was bound to jar. Most of the scenes in which Eulalie French played anything like a fat part took place either on moonlight terraces or in beautifully furnished studios beneath the light of oriental lamps with pink silk shades. And all the men who came in contact with her, except her husband, a clodhopping brute who spent most of his time in riding kit, were perfectly dressed and had dark, clean-cut, sensitive faces. William, accordingly, induced in Jane something closely approximating to the heebie-jeebies. "Hello, old girl," said William, affectionately. "You back? What have you been doing with yourself?" "Oh, shopping," said Jane, listlessly. "See anyone you knew?" For a moment Jane hesitated. "Yes," she said. "I met Rodney Spelvin." Jealousy and suspicion had been left entirely out of William Bates's makeup. He did not start and frown, he did not clutch the arm of his chair. He merely threw back his head and laughed like a hyena. And that laugh wounded Jane more than the most violent exhibition of mistrust could have done. "Good Lord," gurgled William, jovially. "You don't mean to say that bird is still going around loose? I should have thought he would have been lynched years ago. Looks like negligence somewhere." There comes a moment in married life when every wife gazes squarely at her husband and the scales seem to fall from her eyes and she sees him as he is, one of nature's class A fatheads. Fortunately for married men, these times of clear vision do not last long, or there would be few homes left unbroken. It was so that Jane gazed at William now, but unhappily her conviction that he was an outsize in roughneck chumps did not pass. Indeed, all through that evening it deepened. That night she went to bed feeling for the first time that, when the clergyman had said, "Wilt thou, Jane?" and she had replied in the affirmative, a mean trick had been played on an inexperienced girl. And so began that black period in the married life of Jane and William Bates. The mere recollection of which in after years was sufficient to put them right off their short game and even to affect their driving from the tee. To William, having no clue to the cause of the mysterious change in his wife, her behavior was inexplicable. Had not her perfect robustness made such a theory absurd, he would have supposed that she was sickening for something. She golfed now intermittently, and often with positive reluctance. She was frequently listless and distrait. And there were other things about her of which he disapproved. "I say, old girl," he said one evening, "I know you won't mind my mentioning it, and I don't suppose you're aware of it yourself, but recently you've developed a sort of silvery laugh. A nasty thing to have about the home. Try to switch it off, old bird, would you mind?" Jane said nothing. The man was not worth answering. All through the pages of the Purple Fan, Eulalie French's silvery laugh had been highly spoken of and greatly appreciated by one and all. It was the thing about her that the dark, clean-cut, sensitive-faced men most admired. And the view Jane took of the matter was that if William did not like it the poor fish could do the other thing. But this brutal attack decided her to come out into the open with the grievance which had been vexing her soul for weeks past. "William," she said, "I want to say something. William, I am feeling stifled. I'll open the window." Stifled in this beastly little village, I mean, said Jane, impatiently. Nobody ever does anything here except play golf and bridge, and you never meet an artist soul from one year's end to the other. How can I express myself? How can I be myself? How can I fulfill myself? Do you want to? Asked William, somewhat out of his depth. Of course I want to. And I shan't be happy unless we leave this ghastly place and go to live in a studio in town. William sucked thoughtfully at his pipe. It was a tense moment for a man who hated metropolitan life as much as he did. Nevertheless, if the solution of Jane's recent weirdness was simply that she had got tired of the country and wanted to live in town, to the town they must go. After a first involuntary recoil, he nerved himself to the martyrdom like the fine fellow he was. We'll pop off as soon as I can sell the house, he said. I can't wait as long as that. I want to go now. All right, said William, amiably. We'll go next week. William's forebodings were quickly fulfilled. Before he had been in the metropolis 10 days he realized that he was up against it as he had never been up against it before. He and Jane and little Braid Vardon had established themselves in what the house agent described as an attractive bijou studio apartment in the heart of the artistic quarter. There was a nice bedroom for Jane, a delightful cupboard for Braid Vardon, and a cozy corner behind a Japanese screen for William. Most compact. The rest of the place consisted of a room with a large skylight, handsomely furnished with cushions and samovars, where Jane gave parties to the intelligentsia. It was these parties that afflicted William as much as anything else. He had not realized that Jane intended to run a salon. His idea of a pleasant social evening was to have a couple of old friends in for a rubber of bridge, and the almost nightly incursion of a horde of extraordinary birds in floppy ties stunned him. He was unequal to the situation from the first. While Jane sat enthroned on her cushion, exchanging gay badinage with rising young poets and laughing that silvery laugh of hers, William would have to stand squashed in a corner, trying to hold off some bobbed-haired female who wanted his opinion of Augustus John. The strain was frightful, and, apart from the sheer discomfort of it, he found to his consternation that it was beginning to affect his golf. Whenever he struggled out from the artistic zone now to one of the suburban courses, his jangled nerves unfitted him for decent play. Bit by bit his game left him. First he found that he could not express himself with the putter. Then he began to fail to be himself with the mashie-niblick. And when at length he discovered that he was only fulfilling himself about every fifth shot off the tee, he felt that this thing must stop. The conscientious historian will always distinguish carefully between the events leading up to a war and the actual occurrence resulting in the outbreak of hostilities. The latter may be, and generally is, some almost trivial matter, whose only importance is that it fulfills the function of the last straw. In the case of Jane and William, what caused the definite rift was Jane's refusal to tie a can to Rodney Spelvin. The author of The Purple Fan had been from the first a leading figure in Jane's salon. Most of those who attended these functions were friends of his, introduced by him, and he had assumed almost from the beginning the demeanor of a master of the revels. William, squashed into his corner, had long gazed at the man with sullen dislike, yearning to gather him up by the slack of his trousers and heave him into outer darkness. But it is improbable that he would have overcome his native amiability sufficiently to make any active move, had it not been for the black mood caused by his rotten golf. But one evening, when, coming home after doing the Mossy Heath course in 5 strokes over the 100, he found the studio congested with Rodney Spelvin and his friends, many of them playing ukuleles, he decided that flesh and blood could bear the strain no longer. As soon as the last guest had gone he delivered his ultimatum. "Listen, Jane," he said. "Touching on this Spelvin bloke." "Well," said Jane, coldly. She scented battle from afar. "He gives me a pain in the neck." "Really?" said Jane, and laughed a silvery laugh. "Don't do it, old girl," pleaded William, wincing. "I wish you wouldn't call me old girl." "Why not?" "Because I don't like it." "You used to like it." "Well, I don't now." "Oh," said William, and ruminated a while. "Well, be that as it may," he went on, "I want to tell you just one thing. Either you throw the bloke Spelvin out on his left ear and send for the police if he tries to get in again, or I push off. I mean it. I absolutely push off." There was a tense silence. "Indeed?" said Jane at last. "Positively push off," repeated William, firmly. "I can stand a lot, but pie-faced Spelvin tries human endurance too high." "He is not pie-faced," said Jane, warmly. "He is pie-faced," insisted William. "Come round to the Vienna Bonton Bakery tomorrow and I will show you an individual custard pie that might be his brother." "Well, I am certainly not going to be bullied into giving up an old friend just because." William stared. "You mean you won't hand him the mitten?" "I will not." "Think what you are saying, Jane. You positively decline to give this false alarm the quick exit?" "I do." "Then," said William, "all is over. I pop off." Jane stalked without a word into her bedroom. With a mist before his eyes, William began to pack. After a few moments he tapped at her door. "Jane." "Well?" "I'm packing." "Indeed? But I can't find my spare mashie." "I don't care." William returned to his packing. When it was finished, he stole to her door again. Already a faint stab of remorse was becoming blended with his just indignation. "Jane." "Well?" "I've packed." "Really? And now I'm popping." There was silence behind the door. "I'm popping, Jane," said William. And in his voice, though he tried to make it cold and crisp, there was a note of wistfulness. Through the door there came a sound. It was the sound of a silvery laugh. And as he heard it, William's face hardened. Without another word he picked up his suitcase and golf bag, and with set jaw strode out into the night. One of the things that tend to keep the home together in these days of modern unrest is the fact that exalted moods of indignation do not last. William, released from the uncongenial atmosphere of the studio, proceeded at once to plunge into an orgy of golf that for a while precluded regret. Each day he indulged his starved soul with 54 holes, and each night he sat smoking in bed, pleasantly fatigued, reviewing the events of the past 12 hours with complete satisfaction. It seemed to him that he had done the good and sensible thing. And then, slowly at first, but day by day more rapidly, his mood began to change. That delightful feeling of jolly freedom ebbed away. It was on the morning of the 10th day that he first became definitely aware that all was not well. He had strolled out on the links after breakfast with a brassie and a dozen balls for a bit of practice, and, putting every ounce of weight and muscle into the stroke, brought off a snifter with his very first shot. Straight and true the ball sped for the distant green, and William, forgetting everything in the ecstasy of the moment, uttered a gladsome cry. "How about that one, old girl?" he exclaimed. And then, with a sudden sinking of the heart, he realized that he was alone. An acute spasm of regret shot through William's massive bosom. In that instant of clear thinking he understood that golf is not all. What shall it profit a man that he do the long hole in 4, if there is no loving wife at his elbow to squeak congratulations? A dull sensation of forlorn emptiness afflicted William Bates. It passed, but it had been. And he knew it would come again. It did. It came that same afternoon. It came next morning. Gradually it settled like a cloud on his happiness. He did his best to fight it down. He increased his day's output to 63 holes, but found no relief. When he reflected that he had had the stupendous luck to be married to a girl like Jane and had chucked the thing up, he could have kicked himself round the house. He was in exactly the position of the hero of the movie when the subtitle is flashed on the screen, "Came a day when remorse bit like an adder into Roland Spenlow's soul." Of all the chumps who had ever tripped over themselves and lost a good thing, from Adam downwards, he told himself, was the woolen-headedest. On the 15th morning it began to rain. Now, William Bates was not one of your fair-weather golfers. It took more than a shower to discourage him. But this was real rain, with which not even the stoutest enthusiast could cope. It poured down all day in a solid sheet and set the seal on his melancholy. He pottered about the house, sinking deeper and deeper into the slough of despond. And was trying to derive a little faint distraction from practicing putts into a toothglass when the afternoon post arrived. There was only one letter. He opened it listlessly. It was from Jukes, Enderby, and Miller, florists, and what the firm wished to ascertain was whether, his deposit on white violets to be dispatched annually to Mrs. William Bates being now exhausted, he desired to renew his esteemed order. If so, on receipt of the money they would spring to the task of sending same. William stared at the letter dully. His first impression was that Jukes, Enderby, and Miller were talking through their collective hats. White violets? What was all this drivel about white violets? Jukes was an ass. He knew nothing about white violets. Enderby was a fool. What had he got to do with white violets? Miller was a pinhead. He had never deposited any money to have white violets dispatched. William gasped. Yes, by George, he had, though, he remembered with a sudden start. So he had, by golly. Good gosh. It all came back to him. He recalled the whole thing, by Jove. Crikey, yes. The letter swam before William's eyes. A wave of tenderness engulfed him. All that had passed recently between Jane and himself was forgotten, her weirdness, her wish to live in the metropolis, her silvery laugh, everything. With one long, loving gulp, William Bates dashed a not unmanly tear from his eye and, grabbing a hat and raincoat, rushed out of the house and sprinted for the station. At about the hour when William flung himself into the train, Jane was sitting in her studio apartment, pensively watching little Braid Vardon as he sported on the floor. An odd melancholy had gripped her. At first she had supposed that this was due to the rain, but now she was beginning to realize that the thing went much deeper than that. Reluctant though she was to confess it, she had to admit that what she was suffering from was a genuine soul sadness, due entirely to the fact that she wanted William. It was strange what a difference his going had made. William was the sort of fellow you shoved into a corner and forgot about, but when he was not there the whole scheme of things seemed to go bluey. Little by little, since his departure, she had found the fascination of her surroundings tending to wane, and the glamour of her new friends had dwindled noticeably. Unless you were in the right vein for them, Jane felt, they could be an irritating crowd. They smoked too many cigarettes and talked too much. And not far from being the worst of them, she decided, was Rodney Spelvin. It was with a sudden feeling of despair that she remembered that she had invited him to tea this afternoon and had got in a special seed cake for the occasion. The last thing in the world that she wanted to do was to watch Rodney Spelvin eating cake. It is a curious thing about men of the Spelvin type, how seldom they really last. They get off to a flashy start and for a while convince impressionable girls that the search for a soulmate may be considered formally over, but in a very short while reaction always sets in. There had been a time when Jane could have sat and listened to Rodney Spelvin for hours on end. Then she began to feel that from 15 to 20 minutes was about sufficient. And now the mere thought of having to listen to him at all was crushing her like a heavy burden. She had got thus far in her meditations when her attention was attracted to little Braid Vardon, who was playing energetically in a corner with some object which Jane could not distinguish in the dim light. "What have you got there, dear?" she asked. "Wah," said little Braid, a child of few words, proceeding with his activities. Jane rose and walked across the room. A sudden feeling had come to her, the remorseful feeling that for some time now she had been neglecting the child. How seldom nowadays did she trouble to join in his pastimes. "Let mother play too," she said, gently. "What are you playing? Trains? Golf?" Jane uttered a sharp exclamation. With a keen pang she saw that what the child had got hold of was William's spare mashie. So he had left it behind after all. Since the night of his departure it must have been lying unnoticed behind some chair or sofa. For a moment the only sensation Jane felt was an accentuation of that desolate feeling which had been with her all day. How many a time had she stood by William and watched him fuzzle with this club? Inextricably associated with him it was, and her eyes filled with sudden tears. And then she was abruptly conscious of a new, a more violent emotion, something akin to panic fear. She blinked, hoping against hope that she had been mistaken. But no. When she opened her eyes and looked again she saw what she had seen before. The child was holding the mashie all wrong. "Braid," gasped Jane in an agony. All the mother love in her was shrieking at her, reproaching her. She realized now how paltry, how greedily self-centered she had been. Thinking only of her own pleasures, how sorely she had neglected her duty as a mother. Long ere this, had she been worthy of that sacred relation, she would have been brooding over her child, teaching him at her knee the correct Vardon grip, shielding him from bad habits. Seeing to it that he did not get his hands in front of the ball, putting him on the right path as regarded the slow backswing. But, absorbed in herself, she had sacrificed him to her shallow ambitions. And now there he was, grasping the club as if it had been a spade and scooping with it like one of those 24 handicap men whom the hot weather brings out on seaside links. She shuddered to the very depths of her soul. Before her eyes there rose a vision of her son, grown to manhood, reproaching her. "If you had but taught me the facts of life when I was a child, mother," she seemed to hear him say, "I would not now be going round in 120. Rising to 140 in anything like a high wind." She snatched the club from his hands with a passionate cry. And at this precise moment in came Rodney Spelvin, all ready for tea. "Ah, little one," said Rodney Spelvin, gaily. Something in her appearance must have startled him, for he stopped and looked at her with concern. "Are you ill?" he asked. Jane pulled herself together with an effort. "No, quite well." "Ha, ha," she replied, hysterically. She stared at him wildly, as she might have stared at a caterpillar in her salad. If it had not been for this man, she felt, she would have been with William in their snug little cottage, a happy wife. If it had not been for this man, her only child would have been laying the foundations of a correct swing under the eyes of a conscientious pro. If it had not been for this man, she waved him distractedly to the door. "Goodbye," she said. "Thank you so much for calling." Rodney Spelvin gaped. This had been the quickest and most tealess tea party he had ever assisted at. "You want me to go?" he said, incredulously. "Yes, go. Go." Rodney Spelvin cast a wistful glance at the gate-leg table. He had had a light lunch, and the sight of the seed cake affected him deeply. But there seemed nothing to be done. He moved reluctantly to the door. "Well, goodbye," he said. "Thanks for a very pleasant afternoon." "So glad to have seen you," said Jane, mechanically. The door closed. Jane returned to her thoughts. But she was not alone for long. A few minutes later there entered the female cubist painter from downstairs, a manly young woman with whom she had become fairly intimate. "Oh, Bates, old chap," said the cubist painter. Jane looked up. "Yes, Osbaldistone. Just came in to borrow a cigarette. Used up all mine." "So have I, I'm afraid." "Too bad." "Oh, well," said Miss Osbaldistone, resignedly, "I suppose I'll have to go out and get wet. I wish I had had the sense to stop Rodney Spelvin and send him. I met him on the stairs." "Yes, he was in here just now," said Jane. Miss Osbaldistone laughed in her hearty manly way. "Good boy, Rodney," she said, "but too smooth for my taste. A little too ready with the salve." "Yes," said Jane, absently. Has he pulled that one on you yet about your being the original of the heroine of the purple fan? Why, yes, said Jane, surprised. He did tell me that he had drawn ukulele from me. Her visitor emitted another laugh that shook the samovars. He tells every girl he meets the same thing. What? Oh, yes. It's his first move. He actually had the nerve to try to spring it on me. Mind you, I'm not saying it's a bad stunt. Most girls like it. You're sure you've no cigarettes? No? Well, how about a shot of cocaine? Out of that too? Oh, well, I'll be going, then. Pip pip, Bates. Toodaloo, Osbaldistone, said Jane, dizzily. Her brain was reeling. She groped her way to the table, and in a sort of trance cut herself a slice of cake. Wah, said little Braid Vardon. He toddled forward, anxious to count himself in on the share-out. Jane gave him some cake. Having ruined his life, it was, she felt, the least she could do. In a spasm of belated maternal love she also slipped him a jam sandwich. But how trivial and useless these things seemed now. Braid, she cried, suddenly. What? Come here. Why? Let mother show you how to hold that mashie. What's a mashie? A new gash opened in Jane's heart. 4 years old, and he didn't know what a mashie was. And at only a slightly advanced age Bobby Jones had been playing in the American Open Championship. This is a mashie, she said, controlling her voice with difficulty. Why? It is called a mashie. What is? This club. Why? The conversation was becoming too metaphysical for Jane. She took the club from him and closed her hands over it. Now, look, dear, she said, tenderly. Watch how mother does it. She puts the fingers. A voice spoke, a voice that had been absent all too long from Jane's life. You'll pardon me, old girl, but you've got the right hand much too far over. You'll hook for a certainty. In the doorway, large and dripping, stood William. Jane stared at him dumbly. William, she gasped at length. Hello, Jane, said William. Hello, Braid. Thought I'd look in. There was a long silence. Beastly weather, said William. Yes, said Jane. Wet and all that, said William. Yes, said Jane. There was another silence. Oh, by the way, Jane, said William. Knew there was something I wanted to say. You know those violets? Violets? White violets. You remember those white violets I've been sending you every year on our wedding anniversary? Well, what I mean to say, our lives are parted and all that sort of thing, but you won't mind if I go on sending them, what? Won't hurt you, what I'm driving at, and'll please me, see what I mean? So, well, to put the thing in a nutshell, if you haven't any objection, that's that. Jane reeled against the gate-leg table. William. Was it you who sent those violets? Absolutely. Who did you think it was? William, cried Jane, and flung herself into his arms. William scooped her up gratefully. This was the sort of thing he had been wanting for weeks past. He could do with a lot of this. He wouldn't have suggested it himself, but, seeing that she felt that way, he was all for it. William, said Jane, can you ever forgive me? Oh, rather, said William. Like a shot. Though, I mean to say, nothing to forgive, and all that sort of thing. We'll go back right away to our dear little cottage. Fine. We'll never leave it again. Topping. I love you, said Jane, more than life itself. Good egg, said William. Jane turned with shining eyes to little Braid Vardon. Braid, we're going home with Daddy. Where? Home. To our little cottage. What's a cottage? The house where we used to be before we came here. What's here? This is. Which? Where we are now. Why? I'll tell you what, old girl, said William. Just shove a green baize cloth over that kid, and then start in and brew me about 5 pints of tea as strong and hot as you can jolly well make it. Otherwise I'm going to get the cold of a lifetime. The Purification of Rodney Spelvin. It was an afternoon on which one would have said that all nature smiled. The air was soft and balmy. The links, fresh from the rains of spring, glistened in the pleasant sunshine. And down on the second tee young Clifford Wimple, in a new suit of +4s, had just sunk 2 balls in the lake and was about to sink a third. No element, in short, was lacking that might be supposed to make for quiet happiness. And yet on the forehead of the oldest member, as he sat beneath the chestnut tree on the terrace overlooking the 9th green, there was a peevish frown. And his eye, gazing down at the rolling expanse of turf, lacked its customary genial benevolence. His favorite chair, consecrated to his private and personal use by unwritten law, had been occupied by another. That is the worst of a free country, liberty so often degenerates into license. The oldest member coughed. I trust, he said, you find that chair comfortable? The intruder, who was the club's hitherto spotless secretary, glanced up in a goofy manner. That chair, you find it fits snugly to the figure? Chair? Figure? Oh, you mean this chair? Oh, yes. I am gratified and relieved, said the oldest member. There was a silence. Look here, said the secretary, what would you do in a case like this? You know I'm engaged. I do. And no doubt your fiancée is missing you. Why not go in search of her? She's the sweetest girl on earth. I should lose no time. But jealous. And just now I was in my office, and that Mrs. Pettigrew came in to ask if there was any news of the purse which she lost a couple of days ago. It had just been brought to my office, so I produced it. Whereupon the infernal woman, in a most unsuitably girlish manner, flung her arms round my neck and kissed me on my bald spot. And at that moment Adela came in. Death, said the secretary, where is thy sting? The oldest member's pique melted. He had a feeling heart. Most unfortunate. What did you say? I hadn't time to say anything. She shot out too quick. The oldest member clicked his tongue sympathetically. These misunderstandings between young and ardent hearts are very frequent, he said. I could tell you at least 50 cases of the same kind. The one which I will select is the story of Jane Packard, William Bates, and Rodney Spelvin. You told me that the other day. Jane Packard got engaged to Rodney Spelvin, the poet, but the madness passed and she married William Bates, who was a golfer. This is another story of the trio. You told me that one, too. After Jane Packard married William Bates she fell once more under the spell of Spelvin, but repented in time. This is still another story. Making 3 in all. The secretary buried his face in his hands. Oh, well, he said, go ahead. What does anything matter now? First, said the oldest member, let us make ourselves comfortable. Take this chair. It is easier than the one in which you are sitting. No, thanks. I insist. Oh, all right. Woof, said the oldest member, settling himself luxuriously. With an eye now full of kindly goodwill, he watched young Clifford Wimple play his fourth. Then, as the silver drops flashed up into the sun, he nodded approvingly and began. The story which I am about to relate, said the oldest member, begins at a time when Jane and William had been married some 7 years. Jane's handicap was 11, William's 12, and their little son, Braid Vardon, had just celebrated his 6th birthday. Ever since that dreadful time, 2 years before, when, lured by the glamour of Rodney Spelvin, she had taken a studio in the artistic quarter, dropped her golf, and practically learned to play the ukulele, Jane had been unremitting in her efforts to be a good mother and to bring up her son on the strictest principles. And, in order that his growing mind might have every chance, she had invited William's younger sister, Anastasia, to spend a week or two with them and put the child right on the true functions of the mashie. For Anastasia had reached the semi-finals of the last Ladies' Open Championship and, unlike many excellent players, had the knack of teaching. On the evening on which this story opens, the two women were sitting in the drawing room, chatting. They had finished tea. And Anastasia, with the aid of a lump of sugar, a spoon, and some crumbled cake, was illustrating the method by which she had got out of the rough on the 5th at Squashy Hollow. "You're wonderful," said Jane, admiringly. "And such a good influence for Braid. You'll give him his lesson tomorrow afternoon as usual?" "I shall have to make it the morning," said Anastasia. "I've promised to meet a man in town in the afternoon." As she spoke there came into her face a look so soft and dreamy that it roused Jane as if a bradawl had been driven into her leg. As her history has already shown, there was a strong streak of romance in Jane Bates. "Who is he?" she asked, excitedly. "A man I met last summer," said Anastasia. And she sighed with such abandon that Jane could no longer hold in check her womanly nosiness. "Do you love him?" she cried. "Like bricks," whispered Anastasia. "Does he love you?" "Sometimes I think so." "What's his name?" "Rodney Spelvin." "What?" "Oh, I know he writes the most awful bilge," said Anastasia, defensively, misinterpreting the yowl of horror which had proceeded from Jane. "All the same, he's a darling." Jane could not speak. She stared at her sister-in-law aghast. Although she knew that if you put a driver in her hands she could paste the ball into the next county, there always seemed to her something fragile and helpless about Anastasia. William's sister was one of those small, rose-leaf girls with big blue eyes to whom good men instinctively want to give a stroke a hole and on whom bad men automatically prey. And when Jane reflected that Rodney Spelvin had to all intents and purposes preyed upon herself, who stood 5'7" in her shoes and, but for an innate love of animals, could have felled an ox with a blow, she shuddered at the thought of how he would prey on this innocent half-portion. "You really love him?" she quavered. "If he beckoned to me in the middle of a medal round, would come to him," said Anastasia. Jane realized that further words were useless. A sickening sense of helplessness obsessed her. Something ought to be done about this terrible thing, but what could she do? She was so ashamed of her past madness that not even to warn this girl could she reveal that she had once been engaged to Rodney Spelvin herself. That he had recited poetry on the green while she was pudding, and that, later, he had hypnotized her into taking William and little Braid to live in a studio full of samovars. These revelations would no doubt open Anastasia's eyes, but she could not make them. And then, suddenly, fate pointed out a way. It was Jane's practice to go twice a week to the cinema palace in the village, and 2 nights later she set forth as usual and took her place just as the entertainment was about to begin. At first she was only mildly interested. The title of the picture, Tried in the Furnace, had suggested nothing to her. Being a regular patron of the silver screen, she knew that it might quite easily turn out to be an educational film on the subject of clinker coal. But as the action began to develop she found herself leaning forward in her seat, blindly crushing a caramel between her fingers. For scarcely had the operator started to turn the crank when inspiration came to her. Of the main plot of Tried in the Furnace she retained, when finally she reeled out into the open air, only a confused recollection. It had something to do with money not bringing happiness or happiness not bringing money, she could not remember which. But the part which remained graven upon her mind was the bit where Gloria Gooch goes by night to the apartments of the libertine, to beg him to spare her sister, whom he has entangled in his toils. Jane saw her duty clearly. She must go to Rodney Spelvin and conjure him by the memory of their ancient love to spare Anastasia. It was not the easiest of tasks to put this scheme into operation. Gloria Gooch, being married to a scholarly man who spent nearly all his time in a library 100 yards long, had been fortunately situated in the matter of paying visits to libertines. But for Jane the job was more difficult. William expected her to play a couple of rounds with him in the morning and another in the afternoon, which rather cut into her time. However, fate was still on her side, for one morning at breakfast William announced that business called him to town. "Why don't you come, too?" he said. Jane started. No, I don't think I will, thanks. Give you lunch somewhere." "No. I want to stay here and do some practice putting." "All right. I'll try to get back in time for a round in the evening." Remorse gnawed at Jane's vitals. She had never deceived William before. She kissed him with even more than her usual fondness when he left to catch the 10:45. She waved to him till he was out of sight. Then, bounding back into the house, leaped at the telephone and, after a series of conversations with the Marks Morris Glue Factory, the Poor Pussy Home for Indigent Cats, and Messrs. Oakes and Parberry, dealers in fancy goods, at last found herself in communication with Rodney Spelvin. "Rodney?" she said, and held her breath, fearful at this breaking of a 2 years' silence and yet loath to hear another strange voice say, "Wadnumgerwant? Is that you, Rodney?" "Yes." "Who is that?" "Mrs. Bates." "Rodney, can you give me lunch at the Alcazar today at 1? "Can I?" Not even the fact that some unknown basso had got on the wire and was asking if that was Mr. Boodle could blur the enthusiasm in his voice. "I should say so." 1 o'clock, then, said Jane. His enthusiastic response had relieved her. If by merely speaking she could stir him so, to bend him to her will when they met face to face would be pie. 1 o'clock, said Rodney. Jane hung up the receiver and went to her room to try on hats. The impression came to Jane, when she entered the lobby of the restaurant and saw him waiting, that Rodney Spelvin looked somehow different from the Rodney she remembered. His handsome face had a deeper and more thoughtful expression, as if he had been through some ennobling experience. "Well, here I am," she said, going to him and affecting a jauntiness which she did not feel. He looked at her, and there was in his eyes that unmistakable goggle which comes to men suddenly addressed in a public spot by women whom, to the best of their recollection, they do not know from Eve. "How are you?" he said. He seemed to pull himself together. "You're looking splendid." "You're looking fine," said Jane. "You're looking awfully well," said Rodney. "You're looking awfully well," said Jane. "You're looking fine," said Rodney. There was a pause. "You'll excuse me glancing at my watch," said Rodney. "I have an appointment to lunch with somebody here, and it's past the time." "But you're lunching with me," said Jane, puzzled. "With you?" "Yes. I rang you up this morning." Rodney gaped. "Was it you who phoned? I thought you said Miss Bates." "No, Mrs. Bates." "Mrs. Bates?" "Mrs. Bates. Of course. You're Mrs. Bates. Had you forgotten me?" said Jane, in spite of herself a little piqued. "Forgotten you, dear lady? As if I could," said Rodney, with a return of his old manner. "Well, shall we go in and have lunch?" "All right," said Jane. She felt embarrassed and ill at ease. The fact that Rodney had obviously succeeded in remembering her only after the effort of a lifetime seemed to her to fling a spanner into the machinery of her plans at the very outset. It was going to be difficult, she realized, to conjure him by the memory of their ancient love to spare Anastasia. For the whole essence of the idea of conjuring anyone by the memory of their ancient love is that the party of the second part should be aware that there ever was such a thing. At the luncheon table conversation proceeded fitfully. Rodney said that this morning he could have sworn it was going to rain, and Jane said she had thought so, too, and Rodney said that now it looked as if the weather might hold up, and Jane said yes. Didn't it? And Rodney said he hoped the weather would hold up because rain was such a nuisance, and Jane said yes, wasn't it? Rodney said yesterday had been a nice day, and Jane said yes, and Rodney said that it seemed to be getting a little warmer, and Jane said yes. And Rodney said that summer would be here any moment now, and Jane said yes, wouldn't it? And Rodney said he hoped it would not be too hot this summer, but that, as a matter of fact, when you came right down to it, what one minded was not so much the heat as the humidity. And Jane said yes, didn't one? In short, by the time they rose and left the restaurant, not a word had been spoken that could have provoked the censure of the sternest critic. Yet William Bates, catching sight of them as they passed down the aisle, started as if he had been struck by lightning. He had happened to find himself near the Alcazar at lunchtime and had dropped in for a chop. And, peering round the pillar which had hidden his table from theirs, he stared after them with saucer-like eyes. "Oh, dash it," said William. This William Bates, as I have indicated in my previous references to him, was not an abnormally emotional or temperamental man. Built physically on the lines of a motor lorry, he had much of that vehicle's placid and even phlegmatic outlook on life. Few things had the power to ruffle William, but, unfortunately, it so happened that one of these things was Rodney Spelvin. He had never been able entirely to overcome his jealousy of this man. It had been Rodney who had come within an ace of scooping Jane from him in the days when she had been Miss Packard. It had been Rodney who had temporarily broken up his home some years later by persuading Jane to become a member of the artistic set. And now, unless his eyes jolly well deceived him, this human gumboil was once more busy on his dastardly work. Too thick, was William's view of the matter. And he gnashed his teeth in such a spasm of resentful fury that a man lunching at the next table told the waiter to switch off the electric fan, as it had begun to creak unendurably. Jane was reading in the drawing-room when William reached home that night. "Had a nice day?" asked William. "Quite nice," said Jane. "Play golf?" asked William. "Just practiced," said Jane. "Lunch at the club?" "Yes." "I thought I saw that bloke Spelvin in town," said William. Jane wrinkled her forehead. "Spelvin? Oh, you mean Rodney Spelvin? Did you? I see he's got a new book coming out. You never run into him these days, do you?" "Oh, no. It must be 2 years since I saw him." "Oh," said William. "Well, I'll be going upstairs and dressing." It seemed to Jane, as the door closed, that she heard a curious clicking noise, and she wondered for a moment if little Braid had got out of bed and was playing with the mahjong counters. But it was only William gnashing his teeth. There is nothing sadder in this life than the spectacle of a husband and wife with practically identical handicaps drifting apart. And to dwell unnecessarily on such a spectacle is, to my mind, ghoulish. It is not my purpose, therefore, to weary you with a detailed description of the hourly widening of the breach between this once ideally united pair. Suffice it to say that within a few days of the conversation just related the entire atmosphere of this happy home had completely altered. On the Tuesday, William excused himself from the morning round on the plea that he had promised Peter Willard a match, and Jane said what a pity. On Tuesday afternoon William said that his head ached, and Jane said isn't that too bad? On Wednesday morning William said he had lumbago, and Jane, her sensitive feelings now deeply wounded, said oh, had he? After that, it came to be agreed between them by silent compact that they should play together no more. Also, they began to avoid one another in the house. Jane would sit in the drawing-room, while William retired down the passage to his den. In short, if you had added a couple of icons and a photograph of Trotsky, you would have had a mise-en-scene which would have fitted a Russian novel like the paper on the wall. One evening, about a week after the beginning of this tragic state of affairs, Jane was sitting in the drawing-room, trying to read Braid on taking turf. But the print seemed blurred and the philosophy too metaphysical to be grasped. She laid the book down and stared sadly before her. Every moment of these black days had affected Jane like a stymie on the last green. She could not understand how it was that William should have come to suspect, but that he did suspect was plain. And she writhed on the horns of a dilemma. All she had to do to win him back again was to go to him and tell him of Anastasia's fatal entanglement. But what would happen then? Undoubtedly he would feel it his duty as a brother to warn the girl against Rodney Spelvin. And Jane instinctively knew that William warning anyone against Rodney Spelvin would sound like a private of the line giving his candid opinion of the sergeant major. Inevitably, in this case, Anastasia, a spirited girl and deeply in love, would take offense at his words and leave the house. And if she left the house, what would be the effect on little Braid's mashie play? Already, in less than a fortnight, the gifted girl had taught him more about the chip shot from 10 to 15 yards off the green than the local pro had been able to do in 2 years. Her departure would be absolutely disastrous. What it amounted to was that she must sacrifice her husband's happiness or her child's future. And the problem of which was to get the loser's end was becoming daily more insoluble. She was still brooding on it when the postman arrived with the evening mail, and the maid brought the letters into the drawing room. Jane sorted them out. There were 3 for William, which she gave to the maid to take to him in his den. There were 2 for herself, both bills. And there was 1 for Anastasia, in the well-remembered handwriting of Rodney Spelvin. Jane placed this letter on the mantelpiece, and stood looking at it like a cat at a canary. Anastasia was away for the day, visiting friends who lived a few stations down the line, and every womanly instinct in Jane urged her to get hold of a kettle and steam the gum off the envelope. She had almost made up her mind to disembowel the thing and write, "Opened in error," on it, when the telephone suddenly went off like a bomb and nearly startled her into a decline. Coming at that moment, it sounded like the voice of conscience. "Hello?" said Jane. "Hello," replied a voice. Jane clucked like a hen with uncontrollable emotion. It was Rodney. "Is that you?" asked Rodney. "Yes," said Jane. And so it was, she told herself. "Your voice is like music," said Rodney. This may or may not have been the case, but at any rate it was exactly like every other female voice when heard on the telephone. Rodney prattled on without a suspicion. "Have you got my letter yet?" "No," said Jane. She hesitated. "What was in it?" she asked, tremulously. "It was to ask you to come to my house tomorrow at 4. "To your house," faltered Jane. "Yes. Everything is ready. I will send the servants out, so that we shall be quite alone. You will come, won't you?" The room was shimmering before Jane's eyes, but she regained command of herself with a strong effort. "Yes," she said. "I will be there." She spoke softly, but there was a note of menace in her voice. Yes, she would indeed be there. From the very moment when this man had made his monstrous proposal, she had been asking herself what Gloria Gooch would have done in a crisis like this. And the answer was plain. Gloria Gooch, if her sister-in-law was intending to visit the apartments of a libertine, would have gone there herself to save the poor child from the consequences of her infatuated folly. "Yes," said Jane, "I will be there." "You have made me the happiest man in the world," said Rodney. "I will meet you at the corner of the street at 4, then." He paused. "What is that curious clicking noise?" he asked. "I don't know," said Jane. "I noticed it myself. Something wrong with the wire, I suppose. I thought it was somebody playing the castanets. Until tomorrow, then, goodbye." "Goodbye." Jane replaced the receiver. And William, who had been listening to every word of the conversation on the extension in his den, replaced his receiver, too. Anastasia came back from her visit late that night. She took her letter, and read it without comment. At breakfast next morning she said that she would be compelled to go into town that day. "I want to see my dressmaker," she said. "I'll come, too," said Jane. "I want to see my dentist." "So will I," said William. "I want to see my lawyer." "That will be nice," said Anastasia, after a pause. "Very nice," said Jane, after another pause. "We might all lunch together," said Anastasia. "My appointment is not till 4. "I should love it," said Jane. "My appointment is at 4, too." "So is mine," said William. "What a coincidence," said Jane, trying to speak brightly. "Yes," said William. He may have been trying to speak brightly, too, but, if so, he failed. Jane was too young to have seen Salvini in Othello, but, had she witnessed that great tragedian's performance, she could not have failed to be struck by the resemblance between his manner in the pillow scene and William's now. "Then shall we all lunch together?" said Anastasia. "I shall lunch at my club," said William, curtly. "William seems to have a grouch," said Anastasia. "Ha," said William. He raised his fork and drove it with sickening violence at his sausage. So Jane had a quiet little woman's lunch at a confectioner's alone with Anastasia. Jane ordered a tongue and lettuce sandwich, 2 macaroons, marshmallows, ginger ale, and cocoa. And Anastasia ordered pineapple chunks with whipped cream, tomatoes stuffed with beetroot, 3 dill pickles, a raspberry nut sundae, and hot chocolate. And, while getting outside this garbage, they talked merrily, as women will, of every subject but the one that really occupied their minds. When Anastasia got up and said goodbye with a final reference to her dressmaker, Jane shuddered at the depths of deceit to which the modern girl can sink. It was now about 2:45, so Jane had an hour to kill before going to the rendezvous. She wandered about the streets, and never had time appeared to her to pass so slowly, never had a city been so congested with hard-eyed and suspicious citizens. Every second person she met seemed to glare at her as if he or she had guessed her secret. The very elements joined in the general disapproval. The sky had turned a sullen gray, and faraway thunder muttered faintly, like an impatient golfer held up on the tee by a slow foursome. It was a relief when at length she found herself at the back of Rodney Spelvin's house, standing before the scullery window, which it was her intention to force with the pocket-knife won in happier days as second prize in a competition at a summer hotel for those with handicaps above 18. But the relief did not last long. Despite the fact that she was about to enter this evil house with the best motives, a sense of almost intolerable guilt oppressed her. If William should ever get to know of this. Wow! Felt Jane. How long she would have hesitated before the window, one cannot say. But at this moment, glancing guiltily round, she happened to catch the eye of a cat which was sitting on a nearby wall. And she read in this cat's eye such cynical derision that the urge came upon her to get out of its range as quickly as possible. It was a cat that had manifestly seen a lot of life, and it was plainly putting an entirely wrong construction on her behavior. Jane shivered, and with a quick jerk prized the window open and climbed in. It was 2 years since she had entered this house, but once she had reached the hall she remembered its topography perfectly. She mounted the stairs to the large studio sitting room on the first floor, the scene of so many bohemian parties in that dark period of her artistic life. It was here, she knew, that Rodney would bring his victim. The studio was one of those dim, over-ornamented rooms which appeal to men like Rodney Spelvin. Heavy curtains hung in front of the windows. One corner was cut off by a high-backed Chesterfield. At the far end was an alcove, curtained like the windows. Once Jane had admired this studio, but now it made her shiver. It seemed to her one of those nests in which, as the subtitle of Tried in the Furnace had said, only eggs of evil are hatched. She paced the thick carpet restlessly, and suddenly there came to her the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Jane stopped, every muscle tense. The moment had arrived. She faced the door, tight-lipped. It comforted her a little in this crisis to reflect that Rodney was not one of those massive Ethel M. Dell libertines who might make things unpleasant for an intruder. He was only a welterweight egg of evil, and, if he tried to start anything, a girl of her physique would have little or no difficulty in knocking the stuffing out of him. The footsteps reached the door. The handle turned. The door opened. And in strode William Bates, followed by 2 men in bowler hats. "Ha," said William. Jane's lips parted, but no sound came from them. She staggered back a pace or two. William, advancing into the center of the room, folded his arms and gazed at her with burning eyes. "So," said William, and the words seemed forced like drops of vitriol from between his clenched teeth, "I find you here, dash it." Jane choked convulsively. Years ago, when an innocent child, she had seen a conjurer produce a rabbit out of a top hat which an instant before had been conclusively proved to be empty. The sudden apparition of William affected her with much the same sensations as she had experienced then. "How ow ow," she said. "I beg your pardon," said William, coldly. "How ow ow?" "Explain yourself," said William. "How ow ow did you get here? And who are these men?" William seemed to become aware for the first time of the presence of his two companions. He moved a hand in a hasty gesture of introduction. "Mr. Reginald Brown and Mr. Cyril Delancey, my wife," he said, curtly. The two men bowed slightly and raised their bowler hats. "Pleased to meet you," said one. "Most awfully charmed," said the other. "They are detectives," said William. "Detectives? From the Quick Results Agency," said William. "When I became aware of your clandestine intrigues, I went to the agency and they gave me their two best men." "Oh, well," said Mr. Brown, blushing a little. "Most frightfully decent of you to put it that way," said Mr. Delancey. William regarded Jane sternly. "I knew you were going to be here at 4 o'clock, he said. "I overheard you making the assignation on the telephone." "Oh, William." "Woman," said William, "where is your paramour?" Really, said Mr. Delancey, deprecatingly. "Keep it clean," urged Mr. Brown. "Your partner in sin, where is he? I am going to take him and tear him into little bits and stuff him down his throat and make him swallow himself." "Fair enough," said Mr. Brown. "Perfectly in order," said Mr. Delancey. Jane uttered a stricken cry. "William," she screamed, "I can explain all." "All?" said Mr. Delancey. "All?" said Mr. Brown. "All," said Jane. "All?" said William. "All," said Jane. William sneered bitterly. "I'll bet you can't," he said. "I'll bet I can," said Jane. "Well? I came here to save Anastasia." "Anastasia? Anastasia. My sister?" "Your sister." "His sister Anastasia," explained Mr. Brown to Mr. Delancey in an undertone. "What from?" asked William. "From Rodney Spelvin." "Oh, William, can't you understand?" "No, I'm dashed if I can." "I, too," said Mr. Delancey, "must confess myself a little fogged." "And you, Reggie?" "Completely, Cyril," said Mr. Brown, removing his bowler hat with a puzzled frown, examining the maker's name, and putting it on again. "The poor child is infatuated with this man." "With the bloke Spelvin?" "Yes. She is coming here with him at 4 o'clock. "Important," said Mr. Brown, producing a notebook and making an entry. "Important, if true," agreed Mr. Delancey. "But I heard you making the appointment with the bloke Spelvin over the phone," said William. "He thought I was Anastasia. And I came here to save her." William was silent and thoughtful for a few moments. "It all sounds very nice and plausible," he said, "but there's just one thing wrong. I'm not a very clever sort of bird, but I can see where your story slips up. If what you say is true, where is Anastasia?" "Just coming in now," whispered Jane. "Hist. Hist, Reggie," whispered Mr. Delancey. They listened. Yes, the front door had banged, and feet were ascending the staircase. "Hide," said Jane, urgently. "Why?" said William. "So that you can overhear what they say and jump out and confront them." "Sound," said Mr. Delancey. "Very sound," said Mr. Brown. The two detectives concealed themselves in the alcove. William retired behind the curtains in front of the window. Jane dived behind the Chesterfield. A moment later the door opened. Crouching in her corner, Jane could see nothing, but every word that was spoken came to her ears, and with every syllable her horror deepened. "Give me your things," she heard Rodney say, "and then we will go upstairs." Jane shivered. The curtains by the window shook. From the direction of the alcove there came a soft scratching sound, as the two detectives made an entry in their notebooks. For a moment after this there was silence. Then Anastasia uttered a sharp, protesting cry. "Ah, no, no. Please, please." "But why not?" came Rodney's voice. "It is wrong, wrong. I can't see why." It is. You must not do that." "Oh, please, please don't hold so tight." There was a swishing sound, and through the curtains before the window a large form burst. Jane raised her head above the Chesterfield. William was standing there, a menacing figure. The two detectives had left the alcove and were moistening their pencils. And in the middle of the room stood Rodney Spelvin, stooping slightly and grasping Anastasia's parasol in his hands. "I don't get it," he said. "Why is it wrong to hold the damn thing tight?" He looked up and perceived his visitors. "Ah, Bates," he said, absently. He turned to Anastasia again. "I should have thought that the tighter you held it, the more force you would get into the shot." "But don't you see, you poor zimp," replied Anastasia, "that you've got to keep the ball straight. If you grip the shaft as if you were a drowning man clutching at a straw and keep your fingers under like that, you'll pull like the dickens and probably land out of bounds or in the rough. What's the good of getting force into the shot if the ball goes in the wrong direction, you cloth-headed goof?" "I see now," said Rodney, humbly. "How right you always are." "Look here," interrupted William, folding his arms. "What is the meaning of this?" "You want to grip firmly but lightly," said Anastasia. "Firmly but lightly," echoed Rodney. "What is the meaning of this?" "And with the fingers. Not with the palms." "What is the meaning of this?" thundered William. "Anastasia, what are you doing in this man's rooms?" "Giving him a golf lesson, of course. And I wish you wouldn't interrupt." Yes, said Rodney, a little testily. "Don't interrupt, Bates, there's a good fellow. Surely you have things to occupy you elsewhere?" "We'll go upstairs," said Anastasia, "where we can be alone." "You will not go upstairs," barked William. "We shall get on much better there," explained Anastasia. "Rodney has fitted up the top floor back as an indoor practicing room." Jane darted forward with a maternal cry. "My poor child, has this scoundrel dared to delude you by pretending to be a golfer?" "Darling, he is nothing of the kind." Mr. Reginald Brown coughed. For some moments he had been twitching restlessly. "Talking of golf," he said, "it might interest you to hear of a little experience I had the other day at Marshy Moor. I had got a nice drive off the tee, nothing record-breaking, you understand, but straight and sweet. And what was my astonishment on walking up to play my second to find. A rather similar thing happened to me at Windy Waste last Tuesday," interrupted Mr. Delancey. "I had hooked my drive the merest trifle, and my caddy said to me, 'You're out of bounds.' 'I am not out of bounds,' I replied, perhaps a little tersely, for the lad had annoyed me by a persistent habit of sniffing. 'Yes, you are out of bounds,' he said. 'No, I am not out of bounds,' I retorted. Well, believe me or believe me not, when I got up to my ball. 'Shut up,' said William. 'Just as you say, sir,' replied Mr. Delancey, courteously. Rodney Spelvin drew himself up, and in spite of her loathing for his villainy Jane could not help feeling what a noble and romantic figure he made. His face was pale, but his voice did not falter. 'You are right,' he said. 'I am not a golfer. But with the help of this splendid girl here, I hope humbly to be one some day.' 'Ah, I know what you are going to say,' he went on, raising a hand. 'You are about to ask how a man who has wasted his life as I have done can dare to entertain the mad dream of ever acquiring a decent handicap. But never forget, proceeded Rodney, in a low, quivering voice, that Walter J. Travis was nearly 40 before he touched a club, and a few years later he won the British Amateur. True, murmured William. True, true, said Mr. Delancey and Mr. Brown. They lifted their bowler hats reverently. I am 33 years old, continued Rodney, and for 14 of those 33 years I have been writing poetry, and novels with a poignant sex appeal. And if ever I gave a thought to this divine game it was but to sneer at it. But last summer I saw the light. Glory! Glory! Cried Mr. Brown. One afternoon I was persuaded to try a drive. I took the club with a mocking, contemptuous laugh. He paused, and a wild light came into his eyes. I brought off a perfect snifter, he said, emotionally. 200 yards and as straight as a whistle. And, as I stood there gazing after the ball, something seemed to run up my spine and bite me in the neck. It was the golf germ. Always the way, said Mr. Brown. I remember the first drive I ever made. I took a nice easy stance. The first drive I made, said Mr. Delancey, you won't believe this, but it's a fact, was a full. From that moment, continued Rodney Spelvin, I have had but one ambition, to somehow or other, cost what it might, get down into single figures. He laughed bitterly. You see, he said, I cannot even speak of this thing without splitting my infinitives. And, even as I split my infinitives, so did I split my drivers. After that first heavenly slosh I didn't seem able to do anything right. He broke off, his face working. William cleared his throat awkwardly. Yes, but, dash it, he said, all this doesn't explain why I find you alone with my sister in what I might call your lair. The explanation is simple, said Rodney Spelvin. This sweet girl is the only person in the world who seems able to simply and intelligently and in a few easily understood words make clear the knack of the thing. There is none like her, none. I have been to pro after pro, but not one has been any good to me. I am a temperamental man, and there is a lack of sympathy and human understanding about these professionals which jars on my artist soul. They look at you as if you were a half-witted child. They click their tongues. They make odd Scotch noises. I could not endure the strain. And then this wonderful girl, to whom in a burst of emotion I had confided my unhappy case, offered to give me private lessons. So I went with her to some of those indoor practicing places. But here, too, my sensibilities were racked by the fact that unsympathetic eyes observed me. So I fixed up a room here where we could be alone. And, instead of going there, said Anastasia, we are wasting half the afternoon talking. William brooded for a while. He was not a quick thinker. Well, look here, he said at length, this is the point. This is the nub of the thing. This is where I want you to follow me very closely. Have you asked Anastasia to marry you? Marry me? Rodney gazed at him, shocked. Have I asked her to marry me? I, who am not worthy to polish the blade of her niblick. I, who have not even a 30 handicap, ask a girl to marry me who was in the semi-final of last year's Ladies' Open. No, no, Bates, I may be a vers libre poet, but I have some sense of what is fitting. I love her, yes. I love her with a fervor which causes me to frequently and for hours at a time lie tossing sleeplessly upon my pillow. But I would not dare to ask her to marry me. Anastasia burst into a peal of girlish laughter. You poor chump, she cried. Is that what has been the matter all this time? I couldn't make out what the trouble was. Why, I'm crazy about you. I'll marry you any time you give the word. Rodney reeled. What? Of course I will. Anastasia. Rodney. He folded her in his arms. Well, I'm dashed, said William. It looks to me as if I had been making rather a lot of silly fuss about nothing. Jane, I wronged you. It was my fault. No, no. Yes, yes. Jane. William. He folded her in his arms. The two detectives, having entered the circumstances in their notebooks, looked at one another with moist eyes. Cyril, said Mr. Brown. Reggie, said Mr. Delancey. Their hands met in a brotherly clasp. And so, concluded the oldest member, all ended happily. The storm-tossed lives of William Bates, Jane Packard, and Rodney Spelvin came safely at long last into harbor. At the subsequent wedding, William and Jane's present of a complete golfing outfit, including 8 dozen new balls, a cloth cap, and a pair of spiked shoes, was generally admired by all who inspected the gifts during the reception. From that time forward the four of them have been inseparable. Rodney and Anastasia took a little cottage close to that of William and Jane, and rarely does a day pass without a close foursome between the two couples. William and Jane being steady 10s and Anastasia scratch and Rodney a persevering 18, it makes an ideal match. What does? Asked the secretary, waking from his reverie. This one. Which? I see, said the oldest member, sympathetically, that your troubles, weighing on your mind, have caused you to follow my little narrative less closely than you might have done. Never mind, I will tell it again. The story, said the oldest member, which I am about to relate begins at a time when those in peril on the tee. The young man with the fresh, ingenuous face turned from the smoking-room window, through which he had been gazing out upon the smiling links. Nice day, sir, he said. The oldest member looked up with a start. He eyed the young man with a pleased surprise, gratified to find one of the younger generation of his own volition engaging him in conversation. For of late he had noticed on the part of his juniors a tendency to flit rapidly past him with vague mutterings. A beautiful day, he agreed. You are a new member here, I think? Just joined. It's a great course. None better. They give you a good lunch, too. Capital. In fact, the only drawback to the club, the secretary tells me, is that there is a fearful old bore who hangs about the place, lying in wait to collar people and tell them stories. The oldest member wrinkled his forehead thoughtfully. I do not know whom he can have been referring to, he said. No, I cannot recall any such person. But, talking of stories, you will be interested in the one I am about to relate. It is the story of John Gooch, Frederick Pilcher, Sidney McMurdo, and Agnes Flack. A wordless exclamation proceeded from the young man. His fresh face had lost some of its color. He looked wistfully at the door. John Gooch, Frederick Pilcher, Sidney McMurdo, and Agnes Flack, repeated the oldest member, firmly. You may have noticed, said the oldest member, how frequently it happens that practitioners of the arts are quiet, timid little men. Shy in company and unable to express themselves except through the medium of the pencil or the pen. John Gooch was like that. So was Frederick Pilcher. Gooch was a writer and Pilcher was an artist, and they used to meet a good deal at the house of Agnes Flack, where they were constant callers. And every time they met John Gooch would say to himself, as he watched the other balancing a cup of tea and smiling his weak, propitiatory smile, I am fond of Pilcher. But his best friend could not deny that he is a pretty dumb brick. And Pilcher, as he saw Gooch sitting on the edge of his chair and fingering his tie, would reflect, nice fellow as Gooch is, he is certainly a total loss in mixed society. Mark you, if ever men had an excuse for being ill at ease in the presence of the opposite sex, these two had. They were both 18 handicap men, and Agnes Flack was exuberantly and dynamically scratch. She stood about 5 feet 10 in her stockings, and had shoulders and forearms which would have excited the envy and admiration of one of those muscular women who good-naturedly allow 6 brothers, 3 sisters, and a cousin by marriage to pile themselves on her collarbone while the orchestra plays a long-drawn chord and the audience streams out to the bar. Her eye resembled the eye of one of the more imperious queens of history, and when she laughed strong men clutched at their temples to keep the tops of their heads from breaking loose. Even Sidney McMurdo was as a piece of damp blotting paper in her presence. And he was a man who weighed 211 pounds and had once been a semi-finalist in the amateur championship. He loved Agnes Flack with an ox-like devotion. And yet, and this will show you what life is, when she laughed, it was nearly always at him. I am told by those in a position to know that, on the occasion when he first proposed to her, on the 6th green, distant rumblings of her mirth were plainly heard in the clubhouse locker room, causing two men who were afraid of thunderstorms to scratch their match. Such, then, was Agnes Flack. Such, also, was Sidney McMurdo. And such, while we are on the subject, were Frederick Pilcher and John Gooch. Now John Gooch, though, of course, they had exchanged a word from time to time, was in no sense an intimate of Sidney McMurdo. It was consequently a surprise to him when one night, as he sat polishing up the rough draft of a detective story, for his was a talent that found expression largely in blood, shots in the night, and millionaires who are found murdered in locked rooms with no possible means of access except a window 40 feet above the ground, the vast bulk of McMurdo lumbered across his threshold and deposited itself in a chair. The chair creaked. Gooch stared. McMurdo groaned. "Are you ill?" said John Gooch. "Huh," said Sidney McMurdo. He had been sitting with his face buried in his hands, but now he looked up. And there was a red glare in his eyes which sent a thrill of horror through John Gooch. The visitor reminded him of the human gorilla in his novel, The Mystery of the Severed Ear. "For 2 pins, said Sidney McMurdo, displaying a more mercenary spirit than the human gorilla, who had required no cash compensation for his crimes, I would tear you into shreds." "Me?" said John Gooch, blankly. "Yes, you. And that fellow Pilcher, too." He rose, and, striding to the mantelpiece, broke off a corner of it and crumbled it in his fingers. "You have stolen her from me." "Stolen? Whom?" "My Agnes." John Gooch stared at him, thoroughly bewildered. The idea of stealing Agnes Flack was rather like the notion of sneaking off with the Albert Hall. He could make nothing of it. "She is going to marry you." "What?" cried John Gooch, aghast. "Either you or Pilcher." McMurdo paused. "Shall I tear you into little strips and tread you into the carpet?" he murmured, meditatively. "No," said John Gooch. His mind was blurred, but he was clear on that point. "Why did you come butting in?" groaned Sidney McMurdo, absently taking up the poker and tying it into a lover's knot. "I was getting along splendidly until you two pimples broke out. Slowly but surely I was teaching her to love me, and now it can never be. I have a message for you. From her. I proposed to her for the 11th time tonight. And when she had finished laughing she told me that she could never marry a mere mass of brawn. She said she wanted brain. And she told me to tell you and the pest Pilcher that she had watched you closely and realized that you both loved her, but were too shy to speak, and that she understood and would marry one of you." There was a long silence. "Pilcher is a splendid fellow," said John Gooch. "She must marry Pilcher. She will, if he wins the match." "What match?" "The golf match. She read a story in a magazine the other day where 2 men played a match at golf to decide which was to win the heroine. And about a week later she read another story in another magazine where 2 men played a match at golf to decide which was to win the heroine. And a couple of days ago she read 3 more stories in 3 more magazines where exactly the same thing happened, and she has decided to accept it as an omen. So you and the hound Pilcher are to play 18 holes, and the winner marries Agnes." "The winner?" "Certainly. I should have thought, I forget what I was going to say." McMurdo eyed him keenly. "You have not been trifling with this girl's affections, Gooch, I hope?" "No, no. Oh, no. Because, if I thought that, I should know what steps to take. Even now," he paused, and looked at the poker in his hand in a rather yearning sort of way. "No, no," he said, better not, better not. With a gesture of resignation he flung the thing down. "Good night, Weed. The match will be played on Friday morning. And may the better, or, rather, the less impossibly foul, man win." He banged the door, and John Gooch was alone. But not for long. Scarcely half an hour had passed when the door opened once more, to admit Frederick Pilcher. The artist's face was pale, and he was breathing heavily. He sat down, and after a brief interval contrived to summon up a smile. He rose and patted John Gooch on the shoulder. "John," he said, "I am a man who as a general rule hides his feelings. I mask my affections. But I want to say, straight out, here and now, that I like you, John." "Yes," said John Gooch. Frederick Pilcher patted his other shoulder. "I like you so much, John, old man, that I can read your thoughts, strive to conceal them though you may. I have been watching you closely of late, John, and I know your secret. You love Agnes Flack. I don't." "Yes, you do." "Ah, John, said Frederick Pilcher, with a gentle smile, "why try to deceive an old friend? You love her, John. You love that girl. And I have good news for you, John, tidings of great joy. I happen to know that she will look favorably on your suit. Go in and win, my boy, go in and win. Take my advice and dash round and propose without a moment's delay." John Gooch shook his head. He, too, smiled a gentle smile. "Frederick," he said, "this is like you. Noble. That's what I call it. Noble. It's the sort of thing the hero does in Act 2. But it must not be, Frederick. It must not, shall not be. I also can read a friend's heart, and I know that you, too, love Agnes Flack. And I yield my claim. I am excessively fond of you, Frederick, and I give her up to you. God bless you, old fellow. God, in fact, bless both of you." "Look here," said Frederick Pilcher, "have you been having a visit from Sidney McMurdo?" "He did drop in for a minute." There was a tense pause. "What I can't understand," said Frederick Pilcher, at length, peevishly, "is why, if you don't love this infernal girl, you kept calling at her house practically every night and sitting goggling at her with obvious devotion." "It wasn't devotion. It looked like it." "Well, it wasn't. And, if it comes to that, why did you call on her practically every night and goggle just as much as I did?" "I had a very good reason," said Frederick Pilcher. "I was studying her face. I am planning a series of humorous drawings on the lines of Felix the Cat, and I wanted her as a model. To goggle at a girl in the interests of one's art, as I did, is a very different thing from goggling wantonly at her like you." "Is that so?" said John Gooch. "Well, let me tell you that I wasn't goggling wantonly. I was studying her psychology for a series of stories which I am preparing, entitled Madeline Monk, Murderess." Frederick Pilcher held out his hand. "I wronged you, John," he said. "However, be that as it may, the point is that we both appear to be up against it very hard. An extraordinarily well-developed man, that fellow McMurdo. A mass of muscle. And of a violent disposition. Dangerously so." Frederick Pilcher drew out his handkerchief and dabbed at his forehead. "You don't think, John, that you might ultimately come to love Agnes Flack?" "I do not. Love frequently comes after marriage, I believe. So does suicide." "Then it looks to me," said Frederick Pilcher, "as if one of us was for it. I see no way out of playing that match." "Nor I. The growing tendency on the part of the modern girl to read trashy magazine stories," said Frederick Pilcher, severely, "is one that I deplore. I view it with alarm. And I wish to goodness that you authors wouldn't write tales about men who play golf matches for the hand of a woman." "Authors must live," said John Gooch. "How is your game these days, Frederick?" "Improved, unfortunately. I am putting better. I am steadier off the tee. John Gooch laughed bitterly. When I think of the hours of practice I have put in, little knowing that a thing of this sort was in store for me, I appreciate the irony of life. If I had not bought Sandy McHoot's book last spring, I might now be in a position to be beaten 5-4. Instead of which, you will probably win the match on the 12th. John Gooch started. You can't be as bad as that. I shall be on Friday. You mean to say you aren't going to try? I do. You have sunk to such depths that you would deliberately play below your proper form? I have. Pilcher, said John Gooch, coldly, you are a hound, and I never liked you from the start. You would have thought that, after the conversation which I have just related, no depth of low cunning on the part of Frederick Pilcher would have had the power to surprise John Gooch. And yet, as he saw the other come out of the clubhouse to join him on the first tee on the Friday morning, I am not exaggerating when I say that he was stunned. John Gooch had arrived at the links early, wishing to get in a little practice. One of his outstanding defects as a golfer was a pronounced slice. And it seemed to him that, if he drove off a few balls before the match began, he might be able to analyze this slice and see just what was the best stance to take up in order that it might have full scope. He was teeing his third ball when Frederick Pilcher appeared. What, gasped John Gooch. For Frederick Pilcher, discarding the baggy, mustard-colored +4s in which it was his usual custom to infest the links, was dressed in a perfectly fitting morning coat, yellow waistcoat, striped trousers, spats, and patent leather shoes. He wore a high stiff collar, and on his head was the glossiest top hat ever seen off the stock exchange. He looked intensely uncomfortable. And yet there was on his face a smirk which he made no attempt to conceal. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Why are you dressed like that?" John Gooch uttered an exclamation. "I see it all. You think it will put you off your game." "Some idea of the kind did occur to me," replied Frederick Pilcher, airily. "You fiend." "Tut tut, John. These are hard words to use to a friend. You are no friend of mine." "A pity," said Frederick Pilcher, "for I was hoping that you would ask me to be your best man at the wedding." He took a club from his bag and swung it. "Amazing what a difference clothes make. You would hardly believe how this coat cramps the shoulders. I feel as if I were a sardine trying to wriggle in its tin." The world seemed to swim before John Gooch's eyes. Then the mist cleared, and he fixed Frederick Pilcher with a hypnotic gaze. "You are going to play well," he said, speaking very slowly and distinctly. "You are going to play well. You are going to play well. You—" "Stop it," cried Frederick Pilcher. "You are going to play well. You are going—" A heavy hand descended on his shoulder. Sidney McMurdo was regarding him with a black scowl. "We don't want any of your confounded chivalry," said Sidney McMurdo. "This match is going to be played in the strictest spirit of, what the devil are you dressed like that for?" he demanded, wheeling on Frederick Pilcher. I have to go into the city immediately after the match," said Pilcher. "I shan't have time to change." "Well, it's your own affair." "Come along," said Sidney McMurdo, gritting his teeth. "I've been told to referee this match, and I don't want to stay here all day. Toss for the honor, worms." John Gooch spun a coin. Frederick Pilcher called tails. The coin fell heads up. "Drive off, reptile," said Sidney McMurdo. As John Gooch addressed his ball, he was aware of a strange sensation which he could not immediately analyze. It was only when, after waggling 2 or 3 times, he started to draw his club back that it flashed upon him that this strange sensation was confidence. For the first time in his life he seemed to have no doubt that the ball, well and truly struck, would travel sweetly down the middle of the fairway. And then the hideous truth dawned on him. His subconscious self had totally misunderstood the purport of his recent remarks and had got the whole thing nicely muddled up. Much has been written of the subconscious self, and all that has been written goes to show that of all the thick-head, blundering chumps who take everything they hear literally, it is the worst. Anybody of any intelligence would have realized that when John Gooch said, "You are going to play well," he was speaking to Frederick Pilcher. But his subconscious self had missed the point completely. It had heard John Gooch say, "You are going to play well," and it was seeing that he did so. The unfortunate man did what he could. Realizing what had happened, he tried with a despairing jerk to throw his swing out of gear just as the club came above his shoulder. It was a fatal move. You may recall that when Arnaud Massey won the British Open Championship, one of the features of his play was a sort of wiggly twiggle at the top of the swing, which seemed to have the effect of adding yards to his drive. This wiggly twiggle John Gooch, in his effort to wreck his shot, achieved to a nicety. The ball soared over the bunker in which he had hoped to waste at least 3 strokes, and fell so near the green that it was plain that only a miracle could save him from getting a 4. There was a sardonic smile on Frederick Pilcher's face as he stepped onto the tee. In a few moments he would be 1 down, and it would not be his fault if he failed to maintain the advantage. He drew back the head of his club. His coat, cut by a fashionable tailor who, like all fashionable tailors, resented it if the clothes he made permitted his customers to breathe, was so tight that he could not get the club head more than halfway up. He brought it to this point, then brought it down in a lifeless semicircle. "Nice," said Sidney McMurdo, involuntarily. He despised and disliked Frederick Pilcher, but he was a golfer. And a golfer cannot refrain from giving a good shot its meed of praise. For the ball, instead of trickling down the hill as Frederick Pilcher had expected, was singing through the air like a shell. It fell near John Gooch's ball and, bounding past it, ran on to the green. The explanation was, of course, simple. Frederick Pilcher was a man who, in his normal golfing costume, habitually overswung. This fault the tightness of his coat had now rendered impossible. And his other pet failing, the raising of the head, had been checked by the fact that he was wearing a top hat. It had been Pilcher's intention to jerk his head till his spine cracked. But the unseen influence of generations of ancestors who had devoted the whole of their intellect to the balancing of top hats on windy days was too much for him. A minute later the 2 men had halved the hole in 4. The next hole, the water hole, they halved in 3. The third, long and over the hill, they halved in 5. And it was as they moved to the 4th tee that a sort of madness came upon both Frederick Pilcher and John Gooch simultaneously. These 2, you must remember, were 18 handicap men. That is to say, they thought well of themselves if they could get 6s on the 1st, 7s on the 3rd, and anything from 4s to 11s on the 2nd, according to the number of balls they sank in the water. And they had done these 3 holes in 12. John Gooch looked at Frederick Pilcher and Frederick Pilcher looked at John Gooch. Their eyes were gleaming, and they breathed a little stertorously through their noses. "Pretty work," said John Gooch. "Nice stuff," said Frederick Pilcher. "Get a move on, blisters," growled Sidney McMurdo. It was at this point that the madness came upon these 2 men. Picture to yourself their position. Each felt that by continuing to play in this form he was running a deadly risk of having to marry Agnes Flack. Each felt that his opponent could not possibly keep up so hot a pace much longer, and the prudent course, therefore, was for himself to ease off a bit before the crash came. And each, though fully aware of all this, felt that he was dashed if he wasn't going to have a stab at doing the round of his life. It might well be that, having started off at such a clip, he would find himself finishing somewhere in the 80s. And that, surely, would compensate for everything. After all, felt John Gooch, suppose he did marry Agnes Flack, what of it? He had faith in his star, and it seemed to him that she might quite easily get run over by a truck or fall off a cliff during the honeymoon. Besides, with all the facilities for divorce which modern civilization so beneficently provides, what was there to be afraid of in marriage, even with an Agnes Flack? Frederick Pilcher's thoughts were equally optimistic. Agnes Flack, he reflected, was undeniably a pot of poison, but so much the better. Just the wife to keep an artist up to the mark. Hitherto he had had a tendency to be a little lazy. He had avoided his studio and loafed about the house. Married to Agnes Flack, his studio would see a lot more of him. He would spend all day in it, probably have a truckle bed put in and never leave it at all. A sensible man, felt Frederick Pilcher, can always make a success of marriage if he goes about it in the right spirit. John Gooch's eyes gleamed. Frederick Pilcher's jaw protruded. And neck, fighting grimly for their sixes and sometimes even achieving fives, they came to the ninth green, halved the hole, and were all square at the turn. It was at this point that they perceived Agnes Flack standing on the clubhouse terrace. "You-hoo!" cried Agnes in a voice of thunder. And John Gooch and Frederick Pilcher stopped dead in their tracks, blinking like abruptly awakened somnambulists. She made a singularly impressive picture, standing there with her tweed-clad form outlined against the white of the clubhouse wall. She had the appearance of one who is about to play Boadicea in a pageant. And John Gooch, as he gazed at her, was conscious of a chill that ran right down his back and oozed out at the soles of his feet. "How's the match coming along?" she yelled, cheerily. "All square," replied Sidney McMurdo, with a sullen scowl. "Wait where you are for a minute, Germs," he said. "I wish to have a word with Miss Flack." He drew Agnes aside and began to speak to her in a low rumbling voice. And presently it was made apparent to all within a radius of half a mile that he had been proposing to her once again. For suddenly she threw her head back and there went reverberating over the countryside that old familiar laugh. "Ha, ha, 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 ha," laughed Agnes Flack. John Gooch shot a glance at his opponent. The artist, pale to the lips, was removing his coat and hat and handing them to his caddy. And, even as John Gooch looked, he unfastened his braces and tied them round his waist. It was plain that from now on Frederick Pilcher intended to run no risk of not overswinging. John Gooch could appreciate his feelings. The thought of how that laugh would sound across the bacon and eggs on a rainy Monday morning turned the marrow in his spine to ice and curdled every red corpuscle in his veins. Gone was the exhilarating ferment which had caused him to skip like a young ram when a long putt had given him a 46 for the first 9. How bitterly he regretted now those raking drives, those crisp flicks of the machiniblick of which he had been so proud 10 minutes ago. If only he had not played such an infernally good game going out, he reflected, he might at this moment be 8 or 9 down and without a care in the world. A shadow fell between him and the sun. And he turned to see Sidney McMurdo standing by his side, glaring with a singular intensity. "Bah," said Sidney McMurdo, having regarded him in silence for some moments. He turned on his heel and made for the clubhouse. "Where are you going, Sidney?" asked Agnes Flack. "I am going home," replied Sidney McMurdo, "before I murder these 2 miserable harvest bugs. I am only flesh and blood, and the temptation to grind them into powder and scatter them to the 4 winds will shortly become too strong. Good morning." Agnes emitted another laugh like a steam riveter at work. "Isn't he funny?" she said, addressing John Gooch, who had clutched at his scalp and was holding it down as the vibrations died away. "Well, I suppose I shall have to referee the rest of the match myself." "Whose honor?" "Yours?" "Then drive off and let's get at it." The demoralizing effects of his form on the first 9 holes had not completely left John Gooch. He drove long and straight, and stepped back appalled. Only a similar blunder on the part of his opponent could undo the damage. But Frederick Pilcher had his wits well about him. He overswung as he had never overswung before. His ball shot off into the long grass on the right of the course, and he uttered a pleased cry. "Lost ball, I fancy," he said. "Too bad." "I marked it," said John Gooch, grimly. "I will come and help you find it. Don't trouble." "It is no trouble. But it's your hole, anyway. It will take me 3 or 4 to get out of there. It will take me 4 or 5 to get a yard from where I am. "Gooch," said Frederick Pilcher, in a cautious whisper, "you are a cad." "Pilcher," said John Gooch, in tones equally hushed, "you are a low bounder. And if I find you kicking that ball under a bush, there will be blood shed, and in large quantities." "Ha, ha. Ha, ha to you," said John Gooch. The ball was lying in a leathery tuft, and, as Pilcher had predicted, it took 3 strokes to move it back to the fairway. By the time Frederick Pilcher had reached the spot where John Gooch's drive had finished, he had played 7. But there was good stuff in John Gooch. It is often in times of great peril that the artistic temperament shows up best. Missing the ball altogether with his next 3 swings, he topped it with his 4th, topped it again with his 5th, and, playing the like, sent a low, skimming shot well over the green into the bunker beyond. Frederick Pilcher, aiming for the same bunker, sliced and landed on the green. The 6 strokes which it took John Gooch to get out of the sand decided the issue. Frederick Pilcher was 1 up at the 10th. But John Gooch's advantage was short-lived. On the right, as you approach the 11th green, there is a deep chasm, spanned by a wooden bridge. Frederick Pilcher, playing 12, just failed to put his ball into this, and it rolled on to within a few feet of the hole. It seemed to John Gooch that the day was his. An easy mashie shot would take him well into the chasm, from which no 18 handicap player had ever emerged within the memory of man. This would put him 2 down, a winning lead. He swung jubilantly, and brought off a nicely lofted shot which seemed to be making for the very center of the pit. And so, indeed, it was, and it was this fact that undid John Gooch's schemes. The ball, with all the rest of the chasm to choose from, capriciously decided to strike the one spot on the left-hand rail of the wooden bridge which would deflect it towards the flag. It bounded high in the air, fell on the green, and the next moment, while John Gooch stood watching with fallen jaw and starting eyes, it had trickled into the hole. There was a throbbing silence. Then Agnes Flack spoke. "Important, if true," she said. "All square again. I will say one thing for you too, you make this game very interesting." And once more she sent the birds shooting out of the treetops with that hearty laugh of hers. John Gooch, coming slowly to after the shattering impact of it, found that he was clutching Frederick Pilcher's arm. He flung it from him as if it had been a loathsome snake. A grimmer struggle than that which took place over the next 6 holes has probably never been seen on any links. First one, then the other seemed to be about to lose the hole, but always a well-judged slice or a timely top enabled his opponent to rally. At the 18th tee the game was still square. And John Gooch, taking advantage of the fact that Agnes had stopped to tie her shoelace, endeavored to appeal to his one-time friend's better nature. "Frederick," he said, "this is not like you." "What isn't like me?" "Playing this low-down game. It is not like the old Frederick Pilcher." "Well, what sort of a game do you think you are playing?" "A little below my usual, it is true," admitted John Gooch. "But that is due to nervousness. You are deliberately trying to fuzzle, which is not only painting the lily but very dishonest. And I can't see what motive you have, either." "You can't you?" John Gooch laid a hand persuasively on the other's shoulder. "Agnes Flack is a most delightful girl." "Who is?" "Agnes Flack." "A delightful girl?" "Most delightful." "Agnes Flack is a delightful girl?" "Yes." "Oh. She would make you very happy." "Who would?" "Agnes Flack." "Make me happy?" "Very happy." "Agnes Flack would make me happy?" "Yes." "Oh." John Gooch was conscious of a slight discouragement. He did not seem to be making headway. "Well, then, look here," he said, "what we had better do is to have a gentleman's agreement." "Who are the gentlemen?" "You and I." "Oh." John Gooch did not like the other's manner, nor did he like the tone of voice in which he had just spoken. But then there were so many things about Frederick Pilcher that he did not like that it seemed useless to try to do anything about it. Moreover, Agnes Flack had finished tying her shoelace, and was making for them across the turf like a mastodon striding over some prehistoric plain. It was no time for wasting words. "A gentleman's agreement to have the match," he said hurriedly. "What's the good of that? She would only make us play extra holes. We would have those, too. Then we should have to play it off another day. But before that we could leave the neighborhood. Sidney McMurdo would follow us to the ends of the earth. Ah, but suppose we didn't go there? Suppose we simply lay low in the city and grew beards?" "There's something in it," said Frederick Pilcher, reflectively. "You agree? Very well. Splendid." "What's splendid?" asked Agnes Flack, thudding up. "Oh, the match," said John Gooch. "I was saying to Pilcher that this was a splendid match." Agnes Flack sniffed. She seemed quieter than she had been at the outset, as though something were on her mind. "I'm glad you think so," she said. "Do you two always play like this?" "Oh, yes. Yes. This is about our usual form." "Well, push on." It was with a light heart that John Gooch addressed his ball for the last drive of the match. A great weight had been lifted from his mind, and he told himself that now there was no objection to bringing off a real sweet one. He swung lustily. And the ball, struck on its extreme left side, shot off at right angles, hit the lady's tee box, and, whizzing back at a high rate of speed, would have mown Agnes Flack's ankles from under her. Had she not at the psychological moment skipped in a manner extraordinarily reminiscent of the high hills mentioned in Sacred Writ. "Sorry, old man," said John Gooch, hastily, flushing as he encountered Frederick Pilcher's cold look of suspicion. "Frightfully sorry, Frederick, old man. Absolutely unintentional." "What are you apologizing to him for?" demanded Agnes Flack with a good deal of heat. It had been a near thing, and the girl was ruffled. Frederick Pilcher's suspicions had plainly not been allayed by John Gooch's words. He drove a cautious 30 yards, and waited with the air of one suspending judgment for his opponent to play his second. It was with a feeling of relief that John Gooch, smiting vigorously with his brassy, was enabled to establish his bona fides with a shot that rolled to within machiniblic distance of the green. Frederick Pilcher seemed satisfied that all was well. He played his second to the edge of the green. John Gooch ran his third up into the neighborhood of the pin. Frederick Pilcher stooped and picked his ball up. "Here," cried Agnes Flack. "Hey," ejaculated John Gooch. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" said Agnes Flack. Frederick Pilcher looked at them with mild surprise. "What's the matter?" he said. "There's a blob of mud on my ball. I just wanted to brush it off." "Oh, my heavens," thundered Agnes Flack. "Haven't you ever read the rules? You're disqualified." "Disqualified?" "Jolly well qualified," said Agnes Flack, her eyes flashing scorn. "This cripple here wins the match." Frederick Pilcher heaved a sigh. "So be it," he said. "So be it." "What do you mean, so be it?" "Of course it is." "Exactly. Exactly. I quite understand. I have lost the match. So be it." And, with drooping shoulders, Frederick Pilcher shuffled off in the direction of the bar. John Gooch watched him go with a seething fury which for the moment robbed him of speech. He might, he told himself, have expected something like this. Frederick Pilcher, lost to every sense of good feeling and fair play, had double-crossed him. He shuddered as he realized how inky must be the hue of Frederick Pilcher's soul, and he wished in a frenzy of regret that he had thought of picking his own ball up. Too late. Too late. For an instant the world had been blotted out for John Gooch by a sort of red mist. This mist clearing, he now saw Agnes Flack standing looking at him in a speculative sort of way, an odd expression in her eyes. And beyond her, leaning darkly against the clubhouse wall, his bulging muscles swelling beneath his coat and his powerful fingers tearing to pieces what appeared to be a section of lead piping, stood Sidney McMurdo. John Gooch did not hesitate. Although McMurdo was some distance away, he could see him quite clearly, and with equal clearness he could remember every detail of that recent interview with him. He drew a step nearer to Agnes Flack, and, having gulped once or twice, began to speak. "Agnes," he said, huskily, "there is something I want to say to you." "Oh, Agnes, have you not guessed?" "One moment," said Agnes Flack. "If you're trying to propose to me, sign off. There is nothing doing. The idea is all wet." "All wet?" "All absolutely wet. I admit that there was a time when I toyed with the idea of marrying a man with brains, but there are limits. I wouldn't marry a man who played golf as badly as you do if he were the last man in the world." "Sidney," she roared, turning and cupping her mouth with her hands. And a nervous golfer down by the lake hole leaped 3 feet and got his mashie entangled between his legs. "Hello? I'm going to marry you, after all." "Me?" "Yes, you." 3 rousing cheers, bellowed McMurdo. Agnes Flack turned to John Gooch. There was something like commiseration in her eyes, for she was a woman. Rather on the large side, but still a woman. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't mention it," said John Gooch. "I hope this won't ruin your life." "No, no. You still have your art." "Yes, I still have my art." "Are you working on anything just now?" asked Agnes Flack. "I'm starting a new story tonight," said John Gooch. "It will be called Saved from the Scaffold."